Good afternoon and welcome to today's Mary Trump Show live stream of the January 6th Select Committee hearings on the armed insurrection against the United States government. It has been pretty compelling stuff so far, I have to say. And although I don't know if disappointed is the right word. I really wanted the hearings to happen yesterday because they were going so well and it seemed like there was a lot of momentum. But on the other hand, whether they canceled them due to technical difficulties or not, I think it was pretty. If they canceled them for other reasons, it would have been pretty strategic to do so, to let everybody take a break, let everything sink in. I mean, what has been happening so far is just a masterclass in how to make a case. The evidence that they're presenting is undeniable. Everything is backed up. And I think, again, as a strategic prosecutorial point, the brilliance of the fact, and I don't know if everybody's noticed this, but every single witness thus far has been a Republican who was in the Trump administration. So claims of bias are hard to make stick at that point, right? So we know that yesterday's hearings are not the material that was going to be covered in yesterday's hearing won't be covered today. They're going to stick with the plan today to talk about Mike Pence, essentially, not just his role, but the lengths that Donald and others in his orbit went to pressure Mike Pence into breaking the law and overturning the results of a free and fair election, because if he didn't do that, it would hurt Donald's feelings. I want to make something really clear, though. I am it's an extremely good thing, probably understatement of the century, that Mike Pence didn't succumb to that pressure. And I had to say, it's kind of surprising because he has shown himself time after time to be just a lickspittle, the sycophantiest of the sycophants. So that he stuck to his guns at the end is a very good thing. But we need to remember two things. First, he was just doing his job. Okay. And to put that in context, he was finally doing his job after being one of Donald's biggest enablers for 5 years. We were in the situation we were in on January 6th. We were in the danger, or this country was in the danger it was in on January 6th, in large part because of Mike Pence and other people like him. So again, there's no reason to complain about the fact that Mike Pence finally did the right thing, or that many of the other people who have testified and who will testify are finally doing the right thing. But just let's remember who they are before we start valorizing them as people. Awesome. Dean, Brian, I'm so happy to have you guys here.
Glad to be here.
I'm here for a short time, but I'm glad to be here too.
Okay, well then let's start with you, Dean. So to take advantage of you while you're here. Right. What do you expect from today, but especially in light of these new, insanely explosive revelations about Rep. Loudermilk, Ginny Thomas, and John Eastman? I mean, man, the hits just keep on coming.
They do, but I don't think you're going to hear any of that today, to be honest. I think today is...
Good point.
Because we know who the witnesses are.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Mike Pence's former chief of staff, Mark Short, and it's going to be a former Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals judge. To me, what I'm really looking for today is, and I recommend people if they want to read it, is the decision by Judge Carter in March, federal judge considering the application by the January 6th committee for certain documents from John Eastman, who's a lawyer you're going to hear a lot about today. John Eastman got involved late in the circuit. He was not a Trump lawyer in the White House or a campaign lawyer. He was brought in because he had what Judge Carter called a coup in search of a legal theory. And that's what all of this was. It's a great line from the judge's opinion.
Yeah.
I really, people pay real attention today to two crimes. I think we're going to hear about the facts. They're not going to mention the crimes, but the crimes are the ones the January 6th committee laid out in that pleading for the fraud exception to attorney-client privilege. One is obstructing Congress, which is a felony up to 20 years in prison. And the second is defrauding the United States of America. And defrauding the U.S. sounds like you're taking money from Medicare or something. It's not in this setting. It really is remarkable the way the judge analyzed it and found in both cases that Donald Trump, more likely than not, committed 2 felonies. And that's actually higher than the standard you need for a grand jury to return an indictment. Just probable cause is even lower than that. And I had Glenn Kirshner on last night, my show, and we talked about this very issue, that the evidence is now becoming way beyond you would need for an indictment. And and I have people call my show, and I have it more and more, upset with DOJ not doing things, and now blaming President Biden for DOJ not doing things, which concerns me because I don't want them to take it out on President Biden.
Right.
It's a level of frustration. That's all. It's articulation of frustration with things not happening. So we're going to blame somebody. At the end of the day, it's Merrick Garland, and he's got to step up between, I think, in the few months after his hearings and indict Donald Trump. And if he doesn't, then, it's going to be heartbreaking. It's going to affect Democrats in the midterm. Look, it's Naveed Jamali.
Hey, Brian, Mary.
Hey, how are you? My gosh, I haven't seen you in like almost
It's been a minute.
How's it? It's been a minute or two. How are you?
I'm well. I'm excited to watch this stuff and see what horrors we learned today.
Yeah, we were just setting it up in the context of what they're focusing on. And actually, Dean, when I said I think when I said recent revelations, you're right. They have nothing to do with what's happening today. But I'm so excited about them in a scary way. But also, Brian, what about what is relevant for today is that picture of Pence in his the office that he has. I can't remember what it's called, but his symbolic office in the House with Karen Pence drawing the drapes. Because she didn't want the violent mob to see them. I mean,
looking very pensive. Mike Pence looking very pensive.
Yes.
I think Dean made a great point. I think what we're starting to see where we're going after 2 hearings and where we're going leads to Merrick Garland. As I said, that's the audience and I share. I think what we have to explain to some people, though, Dean, is that, and Mary, is that the frustration is because, the old saying, the wheels of justice turn slowly.
Right. And they fine, apparently.
As long as they're turning. That's the thing that people want to see, is that they're turning. And I think this is a step in that direction. I think what you talked about, Mary, about the bombshells of revelations that have come out just in the last 24 hours, I think we're starting to see the rats fleeing the sinking ship. And I think there are going to be more of those revelations over the course of the next few weeks. And I think it will be interesting to see, because we all know that the Department of Justice, the FBI, and the Attorney General Merrick Garland they all have a lot more information than what we've seen.
Right. So
it's going to be interesting if there is no action. And I'm not one of those. I know there are a lot of doomsayers. Like I had Joe Walsh on yesterday, and we were talking about it, and he's going, I don't think it'll end up to anything. They're not going to, you call me the dark Irishman. I have no hope. And I'm going, well, I think there's still hope, and I think that there will be action taken. And I think at the end of the last hearing, I think it was really pointed what Congressman Lofgren said about the big ripoff. They're setting Donald up to kneecap him, to take the one thing from Donald that he absolutely adores and loves and has to have, and that's money. And they're going to get him for fraud.
Oh, not Ivanka.
That's just so you. But by the way, the wire fraud case is harder to prove from a legal point of view than the 2 other felonies outlined by Judge Carter, the January 6th committee raised about obstructing the proceedings. Like if you read the opinion and I couldn't post it in the public chat I wanted to, if you read the opinion, they go through that Eastman knew his plan was not legally sustainable, that he was arguing outside of anything ever accepted. And Trump knew that. And they still pressured Mike Pence. So when you hear the pressure on Mike Pence, that's about the obstruction of Congress.
And that's where else we're going at.
You know what though? I actually, of course, I hope they prove everything. But what was important about the fraud, the big ripoff, is that it shows that they are going after everything. I mean, this is a comprehensive investigation, and Naveed, it seems like that's necessary. Like we need the entire story. And I know it's not relevant for today's hearings, but I do think it's important. We saw the surveillance footage of Rep. Loudermilk and his tour. I think it's damning stuff. Why they've had this for 17 months. And look, I don't ever want to make the perfect the enemy of the good. Sure. But that's 17 months during which the lie has spread, the belief in the lie has spread. So it almost makes the committee's job harder because, all of this damning evidence hasn't been publicly known. Am I being too hard on them or too cynical, or do you think that's a relevant point?
I don't think you're being too hard. Look, I'm not conspiratorial, but I have to believe that at the end of the day, and I'm sure Brian and Dean would agree also, is that
no.
You're gonna say no. Totally when I preface it with that, okay. Look, I think that video and all the stuff that's coming out, including not getting to January 6th, Cawthorn lost the election. We see stuff against Boebert. I think that I agree with Brian. I think that this is going to move forward simply because I think that Mitch McConnell is seeing this as a way to excise the Republican Party of Trump loyalists. Now, I'm not saying that I like Mitch McConnell by any stretch of the imagination, but look, the Department of Justice, the committee, there's an election, and clearly we're seeing Trump candidates some have won, some have lost, but there's still a big push to get his allegiance. Yep. I think McConnell, what we know about McConnell, all the disgusting things that he is, there's one thing that he is true to, which is he's about legacy. Mm-hmm. And I think that he is, he's 78. I mean, he's probably looking at some point for replacement. He's probably looking to leave. He doesn't want the legacy of Trump. So what does that have to do with your question, Mary? I think that some of the reason you're seeing things happen the way you're doing, some of the reasons that you're seeing the Republicans respond in the way that they are, is that there is this awareness by McConnell that if he wants to keep his legacy of being the Supreme Court, which is clearly his legacy, he's got to deal with the Trumpists. And I think that this is going to be something that does end up at Trump. It does certainly end up at people like Loudermilk and others. And I think we're going to see the Department of Justice. It's be hard for them to have any credibility to not pursue any charges. Right. And look, insofar as investigations, if this is truly an investigation, as you know, when I deal with from local to state to federal investigators, the first thing they tell you is we can't talk about anything if there's an open investigation. So why those images may have been, I'll defer and say that perhaps it's because there is an open investigation. That's one of the reasons. It's a BS answer, of course, but I do think that there is something else at play here. Now, that something else may be Mitch McConnell, the dark horse.
Well, Mitch McConnell's always in play, but to Mary, to your point as well, and Naveed, I think that it's not just about going after Donald Trump. I think like that when they're talking about fraud, when they're pursuing those kind of charges, they're talking about the Trumpists, the supporters. They're trying to separate him from them. And at some point in time, if he goes down for anything like that, if he's charged with anything like that, they're hoping that some of the supporters will wake up in Congress and out of Congress and go,
yeah, but Brian, I mean, like you listen to the, Barr, the videotapes of the deposition with Barr and others within the Trump circle. What surprised me is the relative ease at which these people who had professed, I mean, you dealt with them, you saw them, like they completely were like, F that guy. I'm not going down with that ship.
Well,
And
yeah, no kidding. But Bill Barr is I say he's the ultimate survivor.
oh,
He out
completely.
Trump.
Wait
Trump
a second,
threw
though.
everybody else under the bus. Donald, they threw everybody else down.
They did.
Absolutely. But Dean, before you guys got here, I was talking about the importance of remembering that even though Pence did the right thing, which by the way was just doing his job, and Bill Barr finally
He's no
told the
hero.
truth about something, and you could say this about all of them, they are largely responsible for why this all happened in the first place, because they enabled Donald and his worst excesses,
Yeah.
including Mitch McConnell, for 5 years. This needs to be hung around the necks of every single Republican. I hope there's a hearing specifically dedicated to the immediate the reactions of the Republicans in Congress in the immediate aftermath of January 6th and how those positions have changed over time.
You know what's remarkable, we're about to start, but the fact that the media has not pressed Republicans endorsed by Donald Trump. Why do you want the endorsement of a guy who waged the coup and incited a terrorist attack? Why don't they ask that? But here we go. Here's the
Absolutely.
former judge. By the way, this judge and Ted Cruz, he viewed Ted Cruz as his son. Like they were that close, and he turned on Ted Cruz as judge. This guy's remarkable. And that.
It's fascinating.
Well, we'll find out, won't we, Moneypenny?
The Select Committee to investigate the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol will be in order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the committee in recess at any point. Pursuant to House Deposition Authority Regulation 10, the chair announces the committee's approval to release the deposition material represented during today's hearing. Good afternoon. This is almost no idea more un-American than the notion that any one person could choose the American president. No idea more un-American. I agree with that, which is unusual because former Vice President Mike Pence and I don't agree on much. These are his words, spoken a few months ago about Donald Trump's attempt to pressure the former vice president, pressure him into going along with an unlawful and unconstitutional scheme to overturn the 2020 election and give Donald Trump a second term in office that he did not win. Today, the Select Committee is going to reveal the details of that pressure campaign. But what does the Vice President of the United States even have to do with a presidential election? The Constitution says that the Vice President of the United States oversees the process of counting the Electoral College votes, a process that took place on January 6, 2021. Donald Trump wanted Mike Pence to do something no other vice president has ever done. The former president wanted Pence to reject the votes and either declare Trump the winner or send the votes back to the states to be counted again. Mike Pence said no. He resisted the pressure. He knew it was illegal. He knew it was wrong. We are fortunate for Mr. Pence's courage on January 6th. Our democracy came dangerously close to catastrophe. That courage put him in tremendous danger. When Mike Pence made it clear that he wouldn't give in to Donald Trump's scheme, Donald Trump turned the mob on him, a mob that was chanting, "Hang Mike Pence," a mob that had built a hangman's gallows just outside the Capitol. Thanks in part to Mike Pence, our democracy withstood Donald Trump's scheme and the violence of January 6th. But the danger hasn't receded. Led by my colleague, Mr. Aguilar, today we'll lay out the facts for the American people. But first, I'll recognize my colleague from Wyoming, Ms. Cheney, for any opening statement she'd care to offer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Let me take just a few minutes today to put the topic of our hearing in broader context. In our last hearing, we heard unequivocal testimony that President Trump was told his election fraud allegations were complete nonsense. We heard this from members of the Trump campaign. We heard this from President Trump's campaign lawyers. We heard this from President Trump's former Attorney General, Bill Barr. We heard this from President Trump's former acting Attorney General, Jeff Rosen. And we heard this from President Trump's former acting Deputy Attorney General, Richard Donahue. We heard from members of President Trump's White House staff as well. Today, we're focusing on President Trump's relentless effort to pressure Mike Pence to refuse to count electoral votes on January 6th. Here again is how the former vice president phrased it in a speech before the Federalist Society, a group of conservative lawyers.
For this week, that President Trump said I had the right to overturn the election. President Trump is wrong. I had no right to overturn the election. The presidency belongs to the American people and the American people alone. And frankly, there is no idea more un-American than the notion that any one person could choose the American president.
What the president wanted the vice president to do was not just wrong, it was illegal and unconstitutional. We will hear many details in today's hearing, but please consider these 2 points. First, President Trump was told repeatedly that Mike Pence lacked the constitutional and legal authority to do what President Trump was demanding he do. This is testimony from Mark Short, the Vice President's Chief of Staff, who served in the Trump administration in multiple positions over 4 years.
Do we know if he's showing up in person, or we're
But
just
just
going
to
to
pick
take?
up on that, Mr. Short, was it your impression that the vice president had directly
He's actually a
conveyed
good guy.
his
I've known him for
position
20
on
years.
these issues to the president, not just to the world through a dear colleague letter, but directly?
Did you say showing up in
to
person or
Trump
throwing
many
up in
times?
person?
And
That
he
would
had been
be us.
consistent in
Oh,
conveying
right.
his position to the president.
I'll
Very
stop
consistent.
now, I
Okay.
promise.
But President Trump plotted with a lawyer named John Eastman to pressure Pence to do so anyway. As the federal court has explained,
And Jenny
quote,
Thomas.
based on the evidence, the court finds that it is more likely than not that President Trump and Dr. Eastman dishonestly conspired to obstruct the joint session of Congress on January 6th, 2021. What exactly did President Trump know? When exactly did President Trump know that it would be illegal for Mike Pence to refuse to count electoral votes? Here is one sample of testimony given by one of the witnesses before us today, the Vice President's General Counsel.
Did John Eastman ever admit, as far as you know, in front of the president, that his proposal would violate the Electoral Count Act?
I believe he did on the 4th.
That was January 4th, 2 days before the attack on Congress. A second point, please listen to testimony today about all of the ways that President Trump attempted to pressure Vice President Pence, including Donald Trump's tweet at 2:24 p.m. condemning Vice President Mike Pence when President Trump already knew a violent riot was underway at the Capitol. In future hearings, you will hear from witnesses who were present inside the White House, who were present inside the West Wing on that day. But today we focus on the earnest efforts of Mike Pence, who was determined to abide by his oath of office. As Vice President Pence prepared a statement on January 5th and 6th, explaining that he could not illegally refuse to count electoral votes, he said this to his staff.
I mean, the vice president had said, this may be the most important thing I ever say. And so
This meaning statement.
the statement. And he really wanted to make sure that it was just so.
You will hear today that President Trump's White House counsel believed that the vice president did exactly the right thing on January 6th, as did others in the White House, as did Fox News host Sean Hannity. Vice President Pence understood that his oath of office was more
That's a bitter
important than
pill
his
to swallow right
loyalty
there.
to Donald Trump. He did his duty. President Trump unequivocally did not. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
After trying really hard not to do
Without
anything right,
objection,
Pence
I
finally
recognize
did
the
the one
gentleman
thing
from
right.
California, Mr. Aguilar, for an opening statement.
Aguilar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today, we intend to show the American people that January 6th was not an isolated incident. In the weeks culminating before, it was a legal scheme and deception. We've already learned that President Trump knew he lost the 2020 election. Shortly after, he began to look for a way to circumvent our country's most fundamental civic tradition, the peaceful transfer of power. The president latched on to a dangerous theory and would not let go because he was convinced it would keep him in office. We witnessed firsthand what happened when the President of the United States weaponized this theory. The Capitol was overrun, police officers lost their lives, and the Vice President was taken to a secure location because his safety was in jeopardy. Let's take a look at the effect of Donald Trump's words and actions. I want to warn our audience that the video contains explicit content.
Mike Pence is going to have to come through for us. And if he doesn't, that will be a sad day for our country. And Mike Pence, I hope you're going to stand up for the good of our Constitution and for the good of our country. And if you're not, I'm going to be very disappointed in you. I will tell you right now.
He knew it was illegal at that point when he was saying
I'm telling you what,
That's
I'm
right.
hearing the Pence. I hearing the Pence just caved.
No,
Is that true?
I didn't.
I'm hearing reports that Pence caved. I'm telling you, if Pence caved, we're gonna drag motherfuckers through the streets. You fucking politicians are gonna get fucking drugged through the streets.
I guess the hope is that there's such a show of force here that Pence will decide to do the right thing, according to Trump.
That seems clear.
I know Pence can't be alone with women, but can he be alone with his conscience? That's the big question.
Does he have one? That will never not give me chills.
See,
How
I
did we
was
get to
standing
this
there when they
point?
did that. Ugh.
How did we get to the point where President Trump's most radical supporters led a violent attack on the Capitol and threatened to hang President Trump's own vice president? You'll hear from witnesses that Donald Trump pressured Mike Pence to adopt a legally and morally bankrupt idea that the vice president could choose who the next president can be. You'll hear about how the vice president, the White House counsel, and others told Donald Trump that the vice president had no such authority. But President Trump would not listen. You'll hear how Vice President Pence withstood an onslaught of pressure from President Trump, both publicly and privately, a pressure campaign that built to a fever pitch with a heated phone call on January 6th. You'll also hear that the president knew there was a violent mob at the Capitol when he tweeted at 2:24 p.m. that the vice president did not have the, quote, courage to do what needed to be done. Let me be clear. Vice President Pence did the right thing that day. He stayed true to his oath to protect and defend the Constitution. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses this afternoon. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Aguilar. We're honored to have two distinguished witnesses who advised Vice President regarding his role on January 6th. Judge J. Michael Ludick is one of the leading conservative legal thinkers in the country. He served in administrations of President Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. He was appointed by the latter to serve on the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit, where he served from 1991 to 2006. He provided critical advice for Vice President Pence regarding the role of the Vice President in the joint session of Congress shortly
That's
before that fateful
Aquino
moment.
behind him, right?
Yeah.
He's written
Looking
that the
very
Vice
nervous.
President does
Oh,
not
he looks
have
like,
the
yeah.
power to select the next president of the United States. He's also written that that contrary theory espoused by one of his own former law clerks was, quote, incorrect.
Do you
in
think
every
Giuliani's
term.
watching?
We're also
Yeah.
joined today
You do?
by one of the people
Drinking every time
who
they
was
say
with Vice President Pence on
shot.
January
Probably
6th.
drunk, though.
You're watching the wrong one.
No,
counsel
he's
to
just
Vice
drinking his
President
Diet Pepsi.
Pence.
Yeah, Diet
He conducted
Pepsi.
a thorough analysis of the role of the Vice President in the joint session of Congress under the Constitution, the Electoral Count Act, and 230 years of historical practice. But he also has firsthand information about the attack on the Capitol because he lived through it. He was with the Vice President and his own life was in danger. I will now swear in
I wonder if they're going to bring out Quail.
Witnesses will
I was
please
just
stand
thinking
and
that.
raise their right hand.
By the way, I think they're all rage
You
watching
swear or
this.
affirm
Oh,
that
gosh.
the
Because,
guilty
to
of
be
That's what
perjury,
Donald
that
is.
the testimony
Oh,
you're
it's about him,
to
so of
give
course. it is.
Yeah, it's all about
the
him.
whole truth and nothing but the
That was
truth.
probably watching
So
the
help
Price
you
is
God.
Right right now.
Rudy's watching the last
Thank you. You may be seated.
hearing.
Let the record reflect the witnesses.
I think he's
and
probably
the
searching for
affirmative.
that woman from
I now recognize
Borat
myself
movie and
for
seeing if maybe he's got a second chance.
In the United States, the people choose our representatives.
Never know, you know.
Including
Put in the
highest
effort.
official.
Has Quail
of the
ever
land.
weighed in on this? I mean, you
President
mentioned
of
him.
the United
You invoked his
States.
name. Has he ever said
The
anything?
American people did
No,
this
'cause
on November 3rd.
Pence consulted him several
2020.
times.
That's right.
But President Trump did not.
Apparently, the
like
guy that couldn't spell
outcome.
potato saved our
He
republic.
did
by
everything he
talking.
could
Well, he
to
could spell
change
republic,
the
I guess.
result
That's
of the
where we're at.
election.
Dan
He
Quayle
tried
blamed the
litigation,
fictional character Murphy
62
Brown for
cases
problems in this country.
in that
Come on.
He
That would've
tried
been
to pressure
awesome.
state legislatures to reverse the results of the election in their states, but they refused. He tried to enlist the Department of Justice in his efforts to overturn election results, but officials leading the department refused to comply. So eventually, he latched on to a completely nonsensical and anti-democratic theory that one man, his own vice president, could determine the outcome of the election. He wanted the vice president to unilaterally select the president. This theory that the vice president could unilaterally select the president runs completely contrary to our Constitution, our laws, and the entirety of our American experience. But that didn't stop. Didn't matter to President Trump.
He didn't read the
I would
Constitution,
now
so
like
it's kind
to
of a
explore
disadvantage.
how President Trump came to latch
Yeah.
on to this ridiculous legal
He
theory
couldn't count to 10,
that
so
the
he couldn't
vice
get past the Bill
president
of
can
Rights.
select
Who was
the
the
president of the United States.
Florida executive who
Jacob,
overruled for the hanging
How did
Chad in
this
2000?
theory
What was her
first
name?
come to your attention?
Do you remember? And then
Oh, Catherine something.
yes, it's the Republicans are not without precedence here. I mean,
None.
right?
The
Clearly,
first
and that's-
time that I had a conversation with the vice president about the 12th Amendment and the Electoral Count Act was in early December, around December 7th. The vice president called me over to his West Wing office and told me that he had been seeing and reading things that suggested that he had a significant role to play on January 6th in announcing the outcome of the election. He told me that he had been first elected to Congress in 2000 and that one of his earliest memories as a congressman was sitting in on the 2001 certification. And he recalled that Al Gore had
There you
gavelled
go.
down a number of objections that had been raised to Florida. And he asked me mechanically, how does this work at the joint session? What are the rules? And I told the vice president that, in fact, I had a fairly good idea of how things work, that actually there aren't rules that govern the joint session, but what there is a provision of the Constitution that's just one sentence long, and then an Electoral Count Act that had been passed in 1887. And I told the vice president that I could put a memo together for him overnight that would explain the applicable rules.
So, Mr. Jacob, when you looked at this theory, what did you conclude?
So we concluded that what you have is a sentence in the Constitution that is inartfully drafted. But the vice president's first instinct when he heard this
Sounds like my
theory
writing.
was that there was no way
Well-regulated
that our
militia.
framers, who abhorred concentrated power, who had broken away from the tyranny of George III, would ever have put one person, particularly not a person who had a direct interest in the outcome because they were on the ticket for the election, in a role to have decisive impact on the outcome of the election. And our review of text, history, and frankly, just common sense all confirmed the vice president's first instinct on that point. There is no justifiable basis to conclude that the vice president has that kind of authority.
Thank you, Mr. Jacobs. We will hear more today about how, despite this conclusion by you and other top legal advisors, the former president used this discredited theory in his campaign to pressure the vice president to decide the outcome of the presidential election. I now recognize the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Cheney, for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Judge Ludig, thank you as well for being here with us today. You issued a very important statement earlier today, which I urge all Americans to read. And I'd like to ask you, Judge, about one of the sentences in your statement and ask if you could explain to us the significance of it. You say, had the Vice President of the United States obeyed the President of the United States, America would immediately have been plunged into what would have been tantamount to a revolution within a paralyzing constitutional crisis. Could you elaborate on that for us, Judge?
Ouch.
He looks very unhappy.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chairman. That passage in my statement this morning referenced the most foundational concept in America, which is the rule of law. Thus, as I interpret your question, you are asking about that foundational truth of these United States, which we call America. The foundational truth is the rule of law. That foundational truth is, for the United States of America, the profound truth. But it's not merely the profound truth for the United States. It's also the simple truth, the simple foundational truth of the American Republic. Thus, in my view, the hearings being conducted by this select committee are examining that profound truth, namely the rule of law in the United States of America. The specific question, of course, before you and before the nation, not before me, is whether that foundational rule of law was supremely violated on January 6, 2021. Now, to the question specifically that you asked, Madam Vice Chair.
I'd hate to have this guy as a professor.
I believe that had
Be smoking a lot of weed in that class.
Vice President Pence obeyed the orders from his president and the President of the United States of America during the joint session of the Congress of the United States on January 6, 2021, and declared Donald Trump the next President of the United States, notwithstanding that then President Trump had lost the Electoral College vote as well as the popular vote in the 2020 presidential election. That declaration of Donald Trump as the next president would have plunged America into what I believe would have been tantamount to a revolution within a constitutional crisis in America, which in my view, and I'm only one man, would have been the first constitutional crisis since the founding of the Republic.
Wow.
Pretty damning.
Yeah.
That's a huge statement.
Yeah.
Thank you
Took a while to
very
get there,
much,
but
Judge,
there it is.
for your solemn attention to these issues
Solemn,
and
yeah.
for your appearance here today. We're
Wow.
going to describe and discuss in detail what
That's your
happened.
takeaway right there. That's a
and,
clip.
and as we do, I'm going to
Yeah.
describe a few of the details now of some of the actions taken by a gentleman named Kenneth Cheeseborough. After the Electoral College met and cast their votes on December 14th, actually the day before they met, Kenneth Cheeseborough sent a memo to Rudy Giuliani, the president's lead outside counsel. Mr. Cheeseborough wrote to Mayor Giuliani that the vice president is charged with, quote, making judgments about what to do if there are conflicting votes, close quote. Mr. Cheeseborough wrote that when the joint session of Congress got
The
to
name
Arizona
alone.
in the alphabetical list of states, the vice
Right.
president should not count
Cheeseboro,
votes,
Loudermilk.
quote,
Where do they make
because
this
there are
crap
two
up?
slates of votes.
Germany.
His justification, which we will
McDonald's.
learn more about
Germany,
in our
home of
next
many good
hearing,
things they make
was
up.
that a group of Trump supporters in Arizona and other swing states decided to proclaim themselves the true electors for the state, creating two sets of electors, the official electors selected by the state and a group of fake electors. This document was ordered to be produced to the Select Committee by a federal district court judge. As you will see on the screen shortly, Judge David Carter wrote, quote, the draft memo pushed a strategy that knowingly violated the Electoral Count Act. The judge concluded that, quote, the memo is both intimately related to and clearly advanced the plan to obstruct the joint session of Congress on January 6, 2021. A few days later, Professor John Eastman took up this cause. Eastman was at the time a law professor at Chapman University Law School. He prepared a memo outlining the nonsensical theory that the vice president could decide the outcome of the election at the joint session of Congress on January 6th. You will see portions of this memo on the screen. In the first line, he wrote, quote, 7 states have transmitted dual slates of electors to the president of the Senate. But Dr. Eastman goes on to rely on those so-called dual slates of electors to say that Vice President Pence could simply declare President Trump the winner of the 2020 election. Mr. Jacob, were there in fact dual slates of electors from 7 states?
No, there were not.
And just a few days after that, Dr. Eastman wrote another memo. This one, quote, wargaming out several scenarios. He knew the outcome he wanted.
I thought
He
doctor was
saw a
only
way
for
to go
MDs, by the
forward
way.
if he simply pretended
No.
that fake electors were.
I'm a doctor.
A president's
You will see
wife
that
is-
memo up on the screen now.
That's a sort of
Here,
corollary.
Dr. Eastman says the vice president can reject the Biden electors from the states that he calls, quote, disputed.
I wish they
Under
wouldn't
several of the
give it to him,
scenarios,
though.
the vice president could ultimately
Yeah.
just declare Donald Trump the winner, regardless of the vote totals that had already been certified by the states. However, this was false, and Dr. Eastman knew it was false. In other words, it was a lie. In fact, on December 19th, 2020, just 4 days before Dr. Eastman sent this memo, Dr. Eastman himself admitted in an email that the fake electors had no legal weight, referring to the fake electors as, quote, dead on arrival in Congress, end quote, because they did not have a certification from their states. Judge Ludig, did the Trump electors in those 7 states who were not certified by any state authority have any legal significance?
Congresswoman, there was no support whatsoever in either the
Definitely wouldn't want
Constitution
this
of the
to
United
be a
States
nuclear response
nor
if we
the
had like
laws of the United States
save the republic. Let's just put it that way.
for
He
the
builds
vice
up.
president,
He gets there, but
frankly, ever to count alternative electoral slates from the states that had not been officially certified by the designated state official in the Electoral Count Act of 1887. I did notice in the passage from Mr. Eastman's memorandum, and I took a note on it, and correct me if I'm wrong, but he said in that passage that there was both legal authority as well as historical precedent. I do know what Mr. Eastman was referring to when he said that there was historical precedent for doing so. He was incorrect. There was no historical precedent from the beginning of the founding in 1789 that even as mere historical precedent, as distinguished from legal precedent, would support the possibility of the Vice President of the United States quote, counting alternative electoral slates that had not been officially certified to the Congress pursuant to the Electoral Count Act of 1887. I would be glad to explain that historical precedent if the committee wanted, but it would be a digression.
Thank you very much, Judge.
In other words,
I know my
no.
colleagues
Yeah,
will
well,
be pursuing that issue in more depth. And
He's like,
now I
more
will
depth.
go back.
It's just me.
Thank
Right.
you very much.
Let's keep moving.
Pursuant
He doesn't
to
get to talk
Section
much at home.
5C8 of House Resolution 503.
You know, that was only 100
The chair
words.
recognizes the gentleman from
Where
California.
one would have worked.
Mr. Aguilar, and staff
Literally.
counsel, Mr. John Wood, for questioning.
He's
No.
bringing it though.
Thank you, Mr.
That's
Chairman.
all that
Yeah, he
matters.
is.
Of course.
We're
of
fortunate to have a bipartisan
And he has
staff.
a lot of stature for
Senior
conservatives.
investigative counsel
The
John
transcript
Wood
will be killer.
previously served as United
Worth it-
States
it's worth
Attorney
it just for
in
him to
Missouri
be here and say
under
what he's
President
saying.
George W.
Very
Bush.
Well, I think it's
He and I will
painful
So
share
important.
to
today's
say it.
lines of questioning.
I think you
Mr.
can
Wood?
see
Yeah, he
it.
looks tortured. Literally.
Thank you, Mr. Aguilar.
Yeah.
Judge Ludig, I had the incredible honor of serving as one of your law clerks. Another person who did was John Eastman. And you have written that Dr. Eastman's
Plot
theory
twist.
that the vice president could determine who the next president of the United States is, in your words, incorrect at every turn. Could you please explain briefly your analysis?
Briefly.
I'm glad they're having counsel ask
Yeah.
questions.
No.
It was my honor, Mr. Wood, to have you serve as my law clerk. I could answer that question perfectly if I had at my disposal either Mr. Eastman's tweet or my own analytical tweet of September 21st, but I don't. But that said, let me try to remember the analysis of Mr. Eastman's analysis.
And Judge, I can read to you and to the audience, I think what was a really key passage from your very insightful analysis when you wrote, I believed that Professor Eastman was incorrect at every turn of the analysis in his January 2nd memorandum, beginning with his claim that there were legitimate competing slates of electors presented from 7 states. You've already addressed that issue. But your next sentence said, continuing to his conclusion that the vice president could unilaterally decide not to count the votes from the 7 states from which competing slates were allegedly presented. So what was your basis for concluding that Dr. Eastman was incorrect in his conclusion that the vice president could unilaterally decide not to count the votes from these disputed states?
I understand. As I previously stated in response to Congresswoman Chaney, there was no basis in the Constitution or laws of the United States at all for the theory espoused by Mr. Eastman. At all.
There you go.
None.
That's another big one.
With all respect to my co-panelist, he said, I believe in partial response to one of the Select Committee's questions, that the single sentence in the 12th Amendment was, he thought, inartfully written. That single sentence is not inartfully written.
Ow.
It was pristine clear
This guy's good.
that the President of the Senate on January 6th, the incumbent Vice President of the United States, had little substantive constitutional authority, if any, at all. The 12th Amendment, the single sentence that Mr. Jacob refers to, says in substance that following the transmission of the certificates to the Congress of the United States and under the Electoral Count Act of 1887, the Archivist of the United States, that the presiding officer shall open the certificates in the presence of the Congress of the United States in joint session. It then says unmistakably, not even that the Vice President himself shall count the electoral votes. It clearly says merely that the electoral count votes shall then be counted. It was the Electoral Count Act of 1887 that that filled in, if you will, the simple words of the 12th Amendment in order to construct for the country a process for the counting of the sacred process for the counting of the electoral votes from the states, that neither our original Constitution nor even the 12th Amendment had done. The irony, if you will, is that from its founding until 1887, when Congress passed the Electoral Count Act, the nation had been in considerable turmoil during at least 5 of its presidential elections, beginning as soon thereafter from the founding as 1800. So it wasn't for almost 100 years later until the Electoral Count Act was passed. So that's why, in my view, that piece of legislation is not only a work in progress for the country, but at this moment in history, an important work in progress that needs to take place. That was long-winded, I understand.
Well, Judge Ludig, at the risk of oversimplifying
Self-aware.
for the non-lawyers who are watching, is it fair to say that the 12th Amendment basically says 2 things happen? The Vice President opens the certificates and the electoral votes are counted. Is it that straightforward?
Hello?
I would not want that to be my testimony before the Congress of the United States. The language of the 12th Amendment is that simple.
Thank you, Judge. Mr. Jacob, I have a question for you. I believe during your deposition before this committee, you said something to the effect of you'd read every word written about the 12th Amendment, the Electoral Count Act, and historical practice. I know in response to the chairman's earlier question, you gave your bottom line conclusion, but can you tell us a little bit about the process that you and your colleagues went through of researching this issue and what conclusion you came to after your thorough research?
So you, as a lawyer who's analyzing a constitutional provision, you start with the constitutional text, you go to structure, you go to history. So we started with the text. We did not think that the text was quite as unambiguous as Judge Ludig indicated. In part, we had a constitutional crisis in 1876 because in that year, multiple slates of electors were certified by multiple slates. And when it came time to count those votes, the antecedent question of which ones had to be answered. That required the appointment of an independent commission. That commission had to resolve that question, and the purpose of the Electoral Count Act of 1887 had been to resolve those latent ambiguities. Now, I'm in complete agreement with Judge Ludig. It is unambiguous that the vice president does not have the authority to reject electors. There is no suggestion of any kind that it does. There is no mention of rejecting or objecting to electors anywhere in the 12th Amendment. And so the notion that the vice president could do that certainly is not in the text. But the problem that we had and that John Eastman raised in our discussions was we had all seen that in Congress in 2000, in 2004, in 2016, there had been objections raised to various states. And those had even been debated in 2004. And so here you have an amendment that says nothing about objecting or rejecting, and yet we did have some recent practice of that happening within the terms of the Electoral Count Act. So we started with that text. And I recall in my discussion with the vice president, he said, I can't wait to go to heaven and meet the framers and tell them the work that you did in putting together our Constitution is a work of genius. Thank you. It was divinely inspired. There is one sentence that I would like to talk to you a little bit about. So then we went to structure. And again, the vice president's first instinct here is so decisive on this question. There's just no way that the framers of the Constitution, who divided power and authority, who separated it out, who had broken away from George III and declared him to be a tyrant, there was no way that they would have put in the hands of one person the authority to determine who was going to be president of the United States. And then we went to history. We examined every single electoral vote count that had happened in Congress since the beginning of the country. We examined the Electoral Count Act. We examined practice under the Electoral Count Act. And critically, no vice president in 230 years of history had ever claimed to have that kind of authority, hadn't claimed authority to reject electoral votes, had not claimed authority to return electoral votes back to the states. In the entire history of the United States, not once had a joint session ever returned electoral votes back to the states to be counted. And in the crisis of 1876, Justice Bradley of the United States Supreme Court, who supplied the decisive final vote on that commission, had specifically looked at that question and said, first, the vice president clearly doesn't have authority to decide anything. And by the way, also does not have authority to conduct an investigation by sending things back out for a public look at things. So the history was absolutely decisive. And again, part of my discussion with Mr. Eastman was, if you were right, don't you think Al Gore might have liked to have known in 2000 that he had authority to just declare himself president of the United States? Did you think that the Democrat lawyers just didn't think of this very obvious work that he could use to do that? And of course, he acknowledged Al Gore did not and should not have had that authority at that point in time. But so text, structure, history, I think what we had was some ambiguous text that common sense and structure would tell you the answer cannot possibly be that the vice president has that authority. As the committee already played the vice president's remarks, there is almost no idea more un-American than the notion that any one person would choose the American president. And then unbroken historical practice for 230 years that the vice president did not have such an authority.
Thank you. I reserve the remainder of my time.
Mr. Jacob, you weren't the only one who knew that the legal theory was wrong, though. Here's what various advisors to the president thought about that theory.
You've been clear repeatedly with Mr. Meadows about you and the vice president having a different view about his authority on January 6th.
I believe I had.
Did Mr. Meadows ever explicitly or tacitly agree with you or say, yeah, that makes sense or okay?
I believe that that Mark did agree.
What makes you say that?
I believe that's what he told me. But as I mentioned, I think Mark had told so many people so many different things that it was not something that that I would necessarily accept as, okay, well, that means that's resolved.
I see. Tell me more what he told you on this topic.
Well, I think it was that, the vice president doesn't have any broader role. And I think he was understanding of that.
So despite the fact that he may have said other things to the president or others, to you, he said he understands the vice president has no role.
Yes.
Okay.
So is this Mark Meadows?
Several times?
That's Mark Short.
Before
No,
January
he's
6th?
talking about Mark Meadows.
Yes.
Okay.
The way it was communicated to me was that Pat Cipollone thought the idea was nutty and had at one point confronted Eastman basically with the same sentiment.
Pat expressed his admiration for the vice president's actions on the day of the 6th and said that he concurred with the legal analysis that our team had put together to reach that point.
It made no sense to me that in all the protections that were built into the Constitution for a president to get elected and steps that had to be taken, that the power to choose the next president would be sitting with the vice president.
Do you know if Mr. Clark or Mr.
The masked defendant
Morgan, is it Morgan?
Masked.
Knew about that, thought about that, Mr. Eastman's advice?
Yeah, they thought he was crazy.
Do you know if they ever expressed an opinion on whether they thought the vice president had the power that John Eastman said he did?
I know for a fact I heard both say that his theory was crazy, that there was no validity to it in any way, shape, or form.
It's gonna be damning.
And did they express that before January 6th?
Yes.
Yep.
To whom?
I think anyone who would listen.
Okay, what were your
Look at the
prior
baseball bat.
interactions
Do you
with
see that?
Eastman?
Yep.
He described for
It's the
me
creepiest
what he
backup
thought the
ever.
ambiguity was in the statute.
I know.
Why a
Is-
panda?
Was walking
Is he
through it
clubbing to
at that
death
time.
pandas in a
And I said,
bathroom? I don't understand that
Hold on a second, I
background.
want
It
to
looks
understand what
like-
you're saying. You're
looks
saying
like a
that
shower head.
you believe the vice president, acting as president of the Senate, can be the sole decision maker as to, under your theory, who becomes the next president of the United States? And you said yes. I said, are you out of your effing mind? Right? And that was pretty blunt. I said, you're completely crazy. I said, you're going to turn around and tell 78 plus million people in this country that your theory is this is how you're going to invalidate their votes because you think the election was stolen. And I said, they're not going to tolerate that. I said, you're going to cause riots in the streets. And he said, words to the effect of there's been violence in the history of our country, Eric, to protect the democracy or protect the republic.
Oh.
I just
being a shitty lawyer does not
In
make you a
fact,
criminal.
there was a
That
risk
connected
that
it.
the lawyers in the White House counsel's office would resign. For example, Fox News host Sean Hannity expressed concern that the entire White House counsel's office could quit.
Or wine,
you can see
as
from these
Jared would
texts.
say.
Yeah.
Mr. Hannity wrote to White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows that, quote, "We can't lose the entire White House counsel's office. I do not see January 6th happening the way he is being told." A few days later, on January 5th, Mr. Hannity wrote to Mr. Meadows that, quote, "I'm very worried the next 48 hours. Hence pressure, White House counsel will leave." While Sean Hannity was apparently very concerned about the possibility that the White House counsel would resign in protest of the president's effort to force the vice president to violate the Constitution, some others close to the president were more dismissive of the White House counsel's position. Here's what Trump's son-in-law and senior advisor Jared Kushner said during his deposition regarding the White House counsel.
Oh, good.
Pat
Daddy went to
Cipolloni's
jail. I'm
threats to
not.
resign.
Jared, are you aware of instances where Pat Cipollone threatened to
I
resign?
love how she calls him
I
Jared.
kind of, like I said, my interest at that time was on trying to get as many pardons done. And I know
Oh,
that,
God.
he was always, him and the team were always saying, oh, we're going to resign. We're not going to be here if this happens, if that happens. So I kind of took it up to just be whining, to be honest with you.
To be honest with you. Soulless
President's
hack.
own lead outside counsel, Rudy Giuliani,
He's a real boy,
also
Mary.
seemed to concede
Sorry.
the vice president
I
did
don't know.
not
I
have the
think when he
authority
sits down, he
to decide
splinters.
the outcome of the election or send it back to the states. Here's what White House Attorney Eric Hirschman said about his
Chris
call
Christie
with
is
Mayor
loving
Giuliani
this.
on the morning of the 6th.
Totally.
The morning of January 6th, I think he called me out of the blue. Right. And I was like getting dressed. And we had an intellectual discussion about Eastman's, I don't know if it's Eastman's theory per se, but the VP's role. And, he was asking me my view and analysis and then the practical implications of it. And when we finished, he said, like, I believe that, you're probably right. I think he thought we're done that it would be something he'd have to consider if he was sitting on the bench, but he'd probably come down in that, you couldn't interpret it or sustain the argument long term.
Of course, the fact that Mayor Giuliani seemed to admit that the theory was wrong did not stop him from going before the crowd just a few hours later on January 6th and saying the exact opposite. Here's Mayor Giuliani's speech at the Ellipse rally on January 6th.
Oh, God, I don't want to hear that again. I had to hear it live.
Briefly, to make a very important 2 points. Number one, every single thing that has been outlined as the plan for today is perfectly legal. I have Professor Eastman here with me to say a few words about that.
Dun, dun, dun.
He's one of the preeminent constitutional scholars in the United
Really?
States.
Does he know what preeminent
It's
means?
perfectly appropriate, given the questionable
like his hat.
constitutionality
It's like a Republican Indiana Jones.
election counting act.
I will
of
not allow you to
1887,
besmirch Indiana
that the
Jones.
vice president,
I think he just crossed the line, Wash.
and he can do what the president called
I think he's more romancing the stone, trying to
when he
be,
was vice president.
just not quite pulling it off.
He can decide on the validity of these crooked ballots, or he can send it back to the legislatures, give them 5 to 10 days to finally finish the work.
And here's what Dr. Eastman said in his speech at the Ellipse on January 6th.
And all we are demanding of Vice President Pence is this afternoon at 1 o'clock, he let the legislatures of the state look into this so we get to the bottom of it and the American people know whether we have control of the direction of our government or not.
Hope this guy goes to jail.
It's not looking
Dr.
good for him,
Eastman knew
Waj.
his theory didn't
Good.
hold water. Mr. Jacob, you discussed and even debated this theory at length with Dr. Eastman. Did Dr. Eastman ever tell you what he thought the U.S. Supreme Court would do if it had to decide this issue?
Uh-oh.
Yes. We had an extended discussion, an hour and a half to 2 hours on January 5th. And when I pressed him on the point, I said, John, if the vice president did what you were asking him to do, we would lose 9-0 in the Supreme Court, wouldn't we? And he initially started it, well, I think maybe you would lose only 7-2. And after some further discussion, acknowledged, well, yeah, you're right. We would lose 9-0.
8-1.
Appreciate that. In our investigation,
Appreciate
the Select Committee has obtained evidence suggesting that Dr. Eastman never really believed his own theory. Let me explain. On the screen, you can see a draft letter to the president from October 2020.
Somebody's getting charged.
In this
Right,
letter,
this goes from being
an
a
idea
bad
was
lawyer to
proposed
criminality.
Yeah,
that
this
the
is
vice
a
president could
criminal act.
determine which electors to count at the joint session of Congress. But the person writing in blue eviscerates that argument. The person who wrote the comments in blue wrote, quote, "The 12th Amendment only says that the President of the Senate opens the ballots in the joint session, and then, in the passive voice, that the votes shall then be counted." The comments in blue further state, "Nowhere does it suggest that the President of the Senate gets to make the determination on his own." Judge Ludig, does it surprise you that the author of those comments in blue was in fact John Eastman?
Yes, it does, Congressman. But let me, watching this unfold, let me try to unpack what was at the root of what I have called the blueprint to overturn the 2020 election. And it is this, and I had foreshadowed this answer in my earlier testimony to Congresswoman Cheney. Mr. Eastman, from the beginning, said to the president that there was both legal as well as historical precedent for the vice president to overturn the election. And what we've heard today, I believe, is what happened within the White House and elsewhere as all the players led by Mr. Eastman got wrapped around the axle
He's blaming Trump.
by the historical evidence claim by Mr. Eastman. Let me explain very simply. This is what I said would require a digression that I would be glad to undertake if you wished. In short, if I had been advising the Vice President of the United States on January 6th, and even if then Vice President Jefferson and even then Vice President John Adams and even then Vice President Richard Nixon had done exactly what the President of the United States wanted his Vice President to do. I would have laid my body across the road before I would have let the Vice President overturn the 2020 election on the basis of that historical precedent.
It's worth waiting to hear what he
this
says.
body needs to know, and now America needs to know, is that that was the centerpiece of the plan to overturn the 2020 election.
Wow.
It was the historical precedent in the years and with the vice presidents that I named, as Congressman Raskin understands well. And the effort by Mr. Eastman and others was to drive
There's
that
Jamie.
historical precedent up to and under that single sentence, single pristine sentence in the 12th Amendment to the United
Ain't letting
States
that one go.
Constitution. Taking advantage of, if you will, what many have said is the inartful wording of that sentence in the 12th Amendment.
I love this guy.
Scholars before 2020 would have used that historical precedent to argue not that Vice President Pence could overturn the 2020 election by accepting non-certified state electoral votes, but they would have made arguments as to some substantive, not merely procedural, authority possessed by the Vice President of the United States on the statutorily prescribed day for counting the Electoral College votes. This is constitutional mischief.
Judge, I think that's a good point. And I think it kind of begs the question that if the vice president had this power to determine the outcome of a presidential election, why hasn't it ever been used before? Why hasn't that ever happened? Why hasn't a vice president simply rejected the outcome of an election and declared someone else the winner? And instead, as the chairman mentioned in his opening, for over 2 centuries, vice presidents have presided over the joint sessions of Congress in a purely ceremonial role. This even includes, as Mr. Jacob mentioned, Vice President Al Gore. For those of us who are old enough to remember, the 2000 election came down to one state, Florida. There were weeks of recounts and litigation after the election, and Al Gore conceded. Of course, Al Gore was vice president at the time, but he never suggested that he could simply declare himself the winner of the 2000 election when he presided over the counting of the electoral votes. Let's hear what Vice President Gore said when he described the situation he faced in 2000.
Importance of the United States of America in all of human history. In Lincoln's phrase, we still are the last best hope of humankind. And the choice between one's own disappointment in your personal career and upholding the noble traditions of America's democracy is a pretty easy choice when it comes down to it.
Mr. Jacob, did Dr. Eastman say whether he would want other vice presidents such as Al Gore after the 2000 election or Kamala Harris after the 2024 election to have the power to decide the outcome of the election?
So this was one of the many points that we discussed on January 5th. He had come into that meeting trying to persuade us that there was some validity to his theory. I viewed it as my objective to persuade him to acknowledge he was just wrong. And I thought this had to be one of the most powerful arguments. I mean, John, back in 2000, you weren't jumping up and saying Al Gore had this authority to do that. You would not want Kamala Harris to be able to exercise that kind of authority in 2024 when I hope Republicans will win the election. And I know you hope that too, John. And he said, absolutely. Al Gore did not have a basis to do it in 2000. Kamala Harris shouldn't be able to do it in 2024, but I think you should do it today.
Jesus.
Beautiful
Mark Short
articulation
told the
of
select
the right
committee that
word.
Vice President Pence consulted with
Freedom
one
for
of his
me, none for you.
predecessors, Vice
Yeah.
President Dan Quayle, regarding the role of the vice president.
Quayle.
Vice President Quayle confirmed Pence's view that the role was purely ceremonial. Mr. Short also told the committee that he, Mr. Short, received a call from former House Speaker Paul Ryan. Here is Mr. Short's description of his conversation with Speaker Ryan.
Speaker Ryan wanted to call and say, you know, you don't have any greater authority. And I said to him, Mr. Speaker, you know, Mike, you know, he doesn't, you know, he recognizes that. And we sort of laughed about it and he said, I get it. And he later spoke to the vice president too, to, I think, have the same conversation.
Fortunately for the fate of our republic, Vice President Pence refused to go along with President Trump's demands that he determine the outcome of the presidential election. Mr. Jacob, What was the vice president's reaction when you discussed with him the theory that the vice president could decide the outcome of the election?
Congressman, as I've testified, the vice president's first instinct was that there was no way that any one person, particularly the vice president who is on the ticket and has a vested outcome in the election, could possibly have the authority to decide it by rejecting electors or to decisively alter the outcome by suspending the joint session for the first time in history in order to try to get a different outcome from state legislatures.
Despite the fact that the vice president had a strongly held and correct view that he could not decide the outcome of the election, President Trump launched a multi-week campaign of both public and private pressure to get the Vice President Mike Pence to violate the Constitution. Here are some examples of the intense pressure the Vice President faced from all sides and what his Chief of Staff thought of it.
I hope Mike Pence comes through for us, I have to tell you. I hope that our great Vice President comes through for us. He's a great guy.
Every word a grift.
Of course, if he doesn't come through, I won't like him quite as much.
Was it your impression that the vice president had directly conveyed his position on these issues to the president, not just to the world through a Dear Colleague letter, but directly to President Trump?
Many times.
And had been consistent in conveying his position to the president?
Very consistent.
I am aware of the fact that the president was upset with the way Pence acted.
Are we to assume that this is going to be a climactic battle?
Well, I think a lot of that depends on the courage and the spine of the individuals involved.
That'd be a nice way to say a guy named Vice President Mike Pence?
Yes.
I think we've been clear as to what the vice president's role was. I think the vice president been clear with the president, and I think I've been clear with Mark Meadows.
I think the vice president is going to throw down tomorrow and do the right thing because, Lou, like I said before, this is a time for choosing. People are going to look back at this moment tomorrow and remember where every single one of their elected officials were. Did they vote for the rule of law and getting these elections right, or did they give it away to the Democrats and the people who cheated and stole their way through this election?
Gaslighting.
When I got back into town, as talk say like the 5th and the 6th.
Well, that's what he
The
does.
president was, all the attention was on what Mike would do or what Mike wouldn't do.
The vice president really was not wavering in his commitment to what his responsibility was. And so, yeah, was it painful? Sure.
The president's pressure campaign started in December.
They don't want people to see the
For example, although the vice president made his views clearly and unmistakably known to the president and others in the White House, on December 23rd, President Trump retweeted a memo from an individual named Ivan Reichlen entitled Operation Pence Card that called on the vice president to refuse the Electoral College votes from certain states that had certified Joe Biden as the winner. President Trump started his pressure campaign in December, but he dialed up the pressure as January 6th approached. The testimony we have received in our investigation indicates that by the time January 4th arrived, President Trump had already engaged in a, quote, multi-week campaign to pressure the vice president to decide the outcome of the election. This had included private conversations between the two leaders, Trump's tweets, and at least one meeting with members of Congress. We understand that the vice president started his day on January 4th with a rally in Georgia for the Republican candidates in the U.S. Senate runoff. When the vice president returned to Washington, he was summoned to meet with the president regarding the upcoming joint session of Congress. Mr. Jacob, who attended that meeting?
The attendees were the vice president, the president, Mark Short, the chief of staff to the vice president, myself, and John Eastman. There was about a 5-minute period where Mark Meadows came in on a different issue.
Let's show a photo of that meeting. Mr. Jacob, during that meeting between the president and the vice president, what theories did Dr. Eastman present regarding the role of the vice president in counting the electoral votes?
During the meeting on January 4th, Mr. Eastman was opining that there were two legally viable arguments as to authorities that the vice president could exercise 2 days later on January 6th. One of them was that he could reject electoral votes outright. The other was that he could use his capacity as presiding officer to suspend the proceedings and declare essentially a 10-day recess during which states that he deemed to be disputed, there was a list of 5 to 7 states that the exact number changed from conversation to conversation, but that the vice president could sort of issue a demand to the state legislatures in those states to re-examine the election and declare who had won each of those states. So he said that both of those were legally viable options. He said that he did not recommend, upon questioning, he did not recommend what he called the more aggressive option, which was reject outright, because he thought that that would be less politically palatable. The imprimatur of state legislature authority would be necessary to ultimately have public acceptance of an outcome in favor of President Trump. And so he advocated that the preferred course of action would be the procedural route of suspending the joint session and sending the election back to the states.
Mr. Jacob, I know you won't discuss the direct conversations between the president and the vice president. So rather than asking you what the vice president said in that meeting, I'll ask you a more general question. Did the vice president ever waver in his position that he could not unilaterally decide which electors to accept?
The vice president never budged from the position that I have described as his first instinct, which was that it just made no sense from everything that he knew and had studied about our Constitution that one person would have that kind of authority.
And did the vice president ever waver in his position that he could not delay certification and send it back to the states?
No, he did not.
Did Dr. Eastman admit in front of the president that his proposal would violate the Electoral Count Act?
This is going to be on Pence literature
During
when he
that
runs for
meeting
president.
On the 4th, I think I raised the problem that both of Mr. Eastman's proposals would violate several provisions of the Electoral Count Act. Mr. Eastman acknowledged that that was the case, that even what he viewed as the more politically palatable option would violate several provisions, but he thought that we could do so because in his view, the Electoral Count Act was unconstitutional. And when I raised concerns that that position would likely lose in court, his view was that the court simply wouldn't get involved. They would invoke the political question doctrine, and therefore we could have some comfort proceeding with that path.
Mr. Wood?
But just to reiterate, he told you, maybe this was in a later conversation, but he told you at some point that if in fact the issue ever got to the Supreme Court, his theory would lose 9-0, correct?
The next morning, starting around 11 or 11:30, we met for an hour and a half to 2 hours. And in that meeting, I've already described the text, structure, history conversation, but we started walking through all of that. And I said, John, basically what you have is some text that may be a little bit ambiguous, but then nothing else that would support it, including the fact that nobody would ever want that to be the rule. Wouldn't we lose 9-0 in the Supreme Court? And again, he initially started, well, maybe you'd only lose 7-2, but ultimately acknowledged that no, we would lose 9-0. No judge would support his argument.
After his meeting with the vice president, Donald Trump flew to Georgia for a rally in support of the Republican candidates in the United States Senate runoff. Even though the vice president had been steadfast in resisting the president's pressure, President Trump continued to publicly pressure Vice President Pence in his Georgia speech. Rather than focusing exclusively on the Georgia Senate runoff, Trump turned his attention to Mike Pence. Here's what the president said during that rally in Georgia.
Pence comes through for us, I have to tell you. I hope that our great vice president Our great vice president comes through for us. He's a great guy. Of course, if he doesn't come through, I won't like him quite as much.
Second time we've seen that clip.
So the president had been told multiple times that the vice president could not affect the outcome of the election, but he nonetheless publicly pressured Mike Pence to do exactly that by saying, quote, "If he doesn't come through, I won't like him as much." Let's turn now to January 5th. Mr. Wood.
Thank you. That morning, meaning January 5th, the president issued a tweet expressly stating that the vice president had the power to reject electors. Let's look at what the president wrote. Quote, "The vice president has the power to reject fraudulently chosen electors." Mr. Jacob, you've already told us about your meeting with Dr. Eastman and the president on January 4th, and you briefly made reference to the meeting you had with Dr. Eastman the next day, January 5th. Can you tell us a little bit more about that meeting with Dr. Eastman on January 5th? For example, where was the meeting? Who was there?
So at the conclusion of the meeting on the 4th, the president had asked that that our office meet with Mr. Eastman the next day to hear more about the positions he had expressed at that meeting. And the vice president indicated that offered me up as his counsel to fulfill that duty. So we met in Mark Short's office in the executive office building across the way from the White House. Dr. Eastman had a court hearing by Zoom that morning, so it didn't start first thing, but rather started around 11. And that meeting went for about an hour and a half, 2 hours. Chief of Staff Mark Short was at that meeting most of the time. There were a few times that he left. And essentially it was an extended discussion. What most surprised me about that meeting was that when Mr. Eastman came in, he said, "I'm here to request that you reject the electors." So on the 4th, that had been the path that he had said, "I'm not recommending that you do that." But on the 5th, he came in and expressly requested that. And I grabbed a notebook as I was heading into the meeting. I didn't hear much new from him to record, but that was the first thing I recorded in my notes was request that the VP reject.
Just to be clear, you're saying that Dr. Eastman urged the vice president to adopt the very same approach that Dr. Eastman appeared to abandon in the Oval Office meeting with the president the day before. Is that correct?
He had recommended against it the evening before, and then on the 5th came in, and I think it was probably his first words after introductions and as we sat down were, "I'm here to request that you reject the electors in the disputed states."
And you referenced a moment ago some handwritten notes, which you've provided to the Select Committee. I'd now like to show you those notes. As you can see, you wrote there at the top, the writing's a little bit faint in the copy, but you wrote, "Requesting VP reject." Does that accurately reflect what Dr. Eastman asked of you in your meeting on January 5th?
Yes.
And what was your reaction when Dr. Eastman said on January 5th that he was there to ask the Vice President of the United States to reject electors at the joint session of Congress?
I was surprised because I had viewed it as sort of one of the key concessions that we had secured the night before from Mr. Eastman that that he was not recommending that we do that.
So what did you say to him?
Well, as I indicated, to some extent it simplified my task because there are more procedural complexities to the send it back to the states point of view. And I actually had spent most of my evening the night before writing a memorandum to the Vice President explaining all of the specific provisions of the Electoral Count Act that plan would violate. So instead, since he was pushing the sort of robust unilateral power theory, I've already walked the committee through the discussions that we had. We again, I started out with our points of commonality, or what I thought were our points of commonality. We're conservatives, we're small government people, we believe in originalism as the means by which we're going to interpret this. And so we walked through the text, we walked through the history, and the committee has shown footage of Mr. Eastman on the stage on the 6th, claiming that Jefferson supported his position in a historical example of Jefferson. In fact, he conceded in that meeting Jefferson did not at all support his position, that in the election of 1800, there had been some small technical defect with the certificate in Georgia. It was absolutely undisputed that Jefferson had won Georgia. Jefferson did not assert that he had any authority to reject electors. He did not assert that he had any authority to resolve any issue during the course of that. And so he acknowledged by the end that there was no historical practice whatsoever that supported his position. He had initially tried to push examples of Jefferson and Adams. He ultimately acknowledged they did not work. As we've covered, he acknowledged it would lose 9-0 in the Supreme Court. He again tried to say, but I don't think the courts will get involved in this. They'll invoke the political question doctrine. And so if the courts stay out of it, that will mean that we'll have the 10 days for the states to weigh in and resolve it. And then they'll send back the Trump slates of electors and the people will be able to accept that. And I expressed my vociferous disagreement with that point. I did not think that this was a political question. Among other things, if the courts did not step in to resolve this, there was nobody else to resolve it. You would be in a situation where you have a standoff between the President of the United States and, counterfactually, the Vice President of the United States, saying that we've exercised authorities that constitutionally we think we have, by which we have deemed ourselves the winners of the election. You would have an opposed House and Senate disagreeing with that. You would have state legislatures that, to that point, I mean, Republican leaders across those legislatures had put out statements, and we collected these for the vice president as well, that the people had spoken in their states and that they had no intention of reversing the outcome of the election. We did receive some
required
signed
viewing at every
letters
public
that,
school in the country.
Mr. Eastman forwarded us by minorities of leaders in those states, but no state had any legislative house that indicated that it had any interest in it. So you would
Not
have
happening
had
in Florida, that's for sure.
Yep.
just an unprecedented constitutional jump ball situation with that standoff. And as I expressed to him, that issue might well then have to be decided in the streets. Because if we can't work it out politically, we've already seen how charged up people are about this election. And so it would be a disastrous situation to be in. So I said, I think the courts will intervene. I do not see a commitment in the Constitution of the question whether the vice president has that authority to some other actor to resolve. There's arguments about whether Congress and the vice president jointly have a constitutional commitment to generally decide electoral vote issues. I don't think that they have any authority to object or reject them. I don't see it in the 12th Amendment, but nonetheless. And I concluded by saying, John, in light of everything that we've discussed, can't we just both agree that this is a terrible idea? And he couldn't quite bring himself to say yes to that, but he very clearly said, well, yeah, I see we're not going to be able to persuade you to do this. And that was how the meeting concluded.
But you just described a terrifying scenario. Sounds like there could have been chaos under the Eastman approach. And you even described it as it potentially could be decided in the streets. And you described several concessions that Dr. Eastman made throughout that discussion or even debate that you had with him. At some point during that meeting on January 5th, did Dr. Eastman seem to admit that both of the theories that he had presented to the United States the day before? So the theory that the vice president could reject electors outright and declare Donald Trump the winner, and his less aggressive theory that the vice president could simply send it back to the states. At some point in that conversation on the 5th, did Dr. Eastman seem to admit that both of these theories suffered from similar legal flaws?
So I had at least one, possibly two other conversations with Dr. Eastman later that day. In the earlier meeting, we really were focused, because his request that he made had been reject the electors outright, on why that theory was wrong and why we certainly would not be doing that. Later that day, he pivoted back to, well, we hear you loud and clear, you're not going to reject. But remember last night, I said that there was this more prudent course where you could just send it back to the states. Would you be willing to do that? And during the course of our discussion about his renewed request that we consider that option, he acknowledged to me, he put it, both Mr. Eastman and myself are graduates of the University of Chicago Law School. And he said, look,
getting in a plug,
graduates of that august institution, you and I will mutually understand that the underlying legal theory of plenary vice presidential authority is what you have to get there. Because this new theory, as I was pointing out to him, or the procedural theory, still violates several provisions of the Electoral Count Act, as he acknowledged. And the only way that you could ever be able to ignore several provisions of statutory law is if it was pretty clear that they were unconstitutional. And the only way they could be unconstitutional is if the vice president had the plenary authorities that were formed the basis for the reject votes as well. So he acknowledged in those conversations that the underlying legal theory was the same. He just thought that the send it back to the states option would be more politically palatable, and he hoped more palatable to the vice president for that reason.
And in fact, when Dr. Eastman made this concession during that meeting, according to your earlier deposition, Dr. Eastman said, just between us, University of Chicago chickens, is that right?
I don't think that the University of Chicago is going to start a Chicago Chickens fundraising club. But yes, that is the terminology that he used. He said, just between us Chicago chickens, we will understand as lawyers who have studied the Constitution that the underlying basis really is the same.
I reserve the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Wood. Mr. Jacob, the president and the vice president meet again on that same topic the next day, January 5th, correct?
So after my extended meeting with Mr. Eastman that morning, during that time, the vice president had been back at his residence working on his statement to the nation that we released the next day. He got down to the White House some point between 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock as my meeting with Mr. Eastman was wrapping up. And when Mark Short and I went over to meet with the vice president, and actually we thought maybe we had good news. We felt like we had sort of defeated Mr. Eastman, that he was sort of acknowledging that there was no there. But the vice president was then asked down to the Oval Office, and he went down to the Oval Office while Mark and I stayed back in the vice president's office.
You weren't in that meeting.
I was not.
In the book Peril, journalists Bob Woodward and Robert Costa write that the president said, quote, if these people say you have the power, wouldn't you want to? The vice president says, quote, I wouldn't want any one person to have that authority. The president responds, but wouldn't it almost be cool to have that power?
Jeez.
Vice president is reported to have said, no, look, I've read this and I don't see a way to do it. We've exhausted every option. I've done everything I could and then some to find a way around this. It's simply not possible. My interpretation is no. To which the president says, no, no, no. You don't understand, Mike. You can do this. I don't want to be your friend anymore if you don't do this. We asked Mark Short about this during his deposition.
Middle school.
Typical Donald.
An understanding that I would have. In other conversations with the vice president, he articulated to me that no, he wouldn't want that power bestowed upon any one person.
Mr. Jacob, did you, Mr. Short, and the vice president have a call later that day again with the president and Dr. Eastman?
So yes, we did.
And what did Dr. Eastman request on that call?
On that phone call, which I believe was around 5 o'clock that afternoon, Mr. Eastman stated that he had heard us loud and clear that morning. We were not going to be rejecting electors, but would we be open to considering the other course that we had discussed on the 4th, which would be to suspend the joint session and request that state legislatures re-examine certification of the electoral votes.
That same day, January 5th, the New York Times ran a story about the disagreement between the president and the vice president about whether the vice president could determine the outcome of the election. Even though the New York Times story was indisputably correct, Donald Trump denied it. Trump issued a statement claiming that the vice president had agreed that he could determine the outcome of the election, despite the fact that the vice president had consistently rejected that position. Let's look at what the president said in his statement. Quote, "The New York Times report regarding comments Vice President Pence supposedly made to me today is fake news. He never said that. The vice president and I are in total agreement that the vice president has the power to act." Mr. Jacob, how did the vice president's team react to the statement from the president that the vice president could take an active role in determining the winner of the presidential election?
We were shocked and disappointed because whoever had written and put that statement out, it was categorically untrue.
Vice President's Chief of Staff, Mark Short, had an angry phone call with Trump campaign senior advisor Jason Miller about this statement. Here's what Mr. Short and Mr. Miller told the committee about that call.
Okay, tell me about the conversation you had with Jason.
Brief, I was irritated and expressed displeasure that a statement could have gone out that misrepresented the vice president's viewpoint without consultation.
The statement says the vice president and I are in total agreement that the vice president has the power to act. Is that incorrect?
I think the record shows that that's incorrect.
Yeah.
I mean, we've been through many documents that clarify that this is not where the vice president was.
Right. So essentially, the president's sending out a baldly false statement about being in alignment, purported alignment with the vice president, despite all of the predicate that you indicated had gone before of their respective positions. Is that effectively what happened?
I interpret the statement as false. I'll let you figure out who sent it out.
When Mark Short contacted you, he was upset. Is that what you said?
He clearly was not pleased.
Tell us what he said.
What's the process for putting out a statement for a meeting where only 2 people were in the room?
Did he ask you to retract the statement?
No, I think it went right to what's the process for putting out a statement for a meeting when only 2 people were in the room.
And he clearly disagreed with the substance though, right? Because he said the vice president doesn't agree with this.
Trying to think what exactly he said. I mean, the tone was very clearly that he used some language to strongly infer that the vice president disagreed with that take, but I don't remember what that language was.
Did he dictate this statement?
He dictated most of it. I mean, typically on these, I might have a couple of wording suggestions, or maybe I have a sentence or a rough framework or something of that. But I know with specificity on this one that it was me and him on the phone talking through it. And ultimately the way this came out was the way that he wanted to.
The dispute between the president and the vice president had grown to the point where the vice president's chief of staff, Mark Short, was concerned that the president could, in Mr. Short's words, quote, lash out at the vice president on January 6th. In fact, Mr. Short was so concerned about it that he talked with the head of the vice president's Secret Service detail on January 5th. Here's Mr. Short.
Concern was for the vice president's security, and so I wanted to make sure the head of the vice president's Secret Service was aware that that likely, as these disagreements became more public, that the president would lash out in some way.
After the recess, we will hear that Mark Short's concerns were justified. The vice president was in danger. Mr. Chairman, I reserve.
That's interesting because it pits
Pursuant to the
service
order
against
of the
each
committee
other potentially.
Yeah.
The chair declares the committee in recess for a period of approximately 10 minutes.
That's a lot to unpack.
It's a lot to unpack.
Oh, okay. So
Stuff
hang
down,
on.
Oral.
Let's just kind of, first of all, 10 minutes. That's not enough time. Okay.
You're just scarfing down lunches. Oh, Subway.
So, right. Well, there's that too. There's the food issue. But oh my God. I just, as a quick kind of, my overarching feeling about all of this is that it makes me so incredibly sad. I feel like crying. Because it's so damning and so much of this was just kind of out there already. I'm so grateful that they're doing it in such a compelling way. I mean, they've got it nailed down, but it's still devastating for this country and for all of us personally. But that aside, I'd like to get everybody's just, one or two takeaways. One of mine is that Judge Luttig, first of all, he has you hanging on every word, so good for him. The fact that he went back to the founding as this being unprecedented. Usually the Civil War is the backstop, so I thought that was huge for somebody, especially of his stature, to say that. And just listening to these depositions and then hearing their statements in real time that contradicted their depositions, that this was so coordinated, so planned at every level. And I guess my question is, why are these people still free? Waj, let's start with you.
Yeah. So, this might be an unpopular opinion, but Judge Luttig was the MVP for me. Apparently, I also read that he might have a stutter. And also, it's clear that he was being very deliberate. He knows this is for posterity. He knows this is for history. He knows his reputation. And he's a person who cares deeply about the Constitution and this country.
I agree with you 100%.
Yeah, and he was, to me, really the takeaways were him with these damning statements, constitutional mischief, right? Like the individual to the left of him. He didn't give, what's very important here, every single rationalization, even the best faith rationalization for perhaps Republicans to muse about using the Constitution this way, he just crushed it. Like each and every opportunity that there was even an opening that his colleague to his left, whose name I'm forgetting, said, well, we were entertaining this one line. He goes, no, there's nothing. And so I think, the Democrats are aware that most people aren't watching this right now. That's fine. But there will be clips. This will be in the news. And then you will have a judge of such stature laying to waste the entirety of the big lie theory that has now contaminated the right wing. The second thing I'll say, and the last thing I'll say, the reason why I think this is important, is you have Republicans and conservatives making the case against Donald Trump. They brought out all conservatives. They brought out all Republicans. You got you got like Jason Miller. You got Jared. You got Republicans throwing Trump and Eastman under the bus. And sorry, I'll cheat. The third thing I'll say is John Eastman isn't looking like a good dude right now. What I'm really curious about, and if I want Democrats to go for the jugular, is make the case, the damning case against Eastman, which is already made, spend extra time, maybe do an extra hearing, connect Eastman to Ginny Thomas.
That has to happen, in my view. It has to happen. I'm skeptical, unfortunately, mostly because of Vice Chair Liz Cheney. But there's hope. I mean, I think the more information we hear outside of the hearings. I mean, we heard so much this week that wasn't even had nothing to do with the committee, and maybe it'll force their hand. Dahlia, what are your couple of takeaways?
I'll go quick. I mean, one thing is just to re-up, Judge Luttig, I know everybody's sort of upset at how slowly he's talking, but holy cow, is he deliberate? And I just want to say that, like, the relationship between judges and their clerks is second only to family. Mm-hmm. And so when your one son is cross-examining you, his former clerk, John Wood, and you are saying about your other son, John Eastman, this guy is a loon. And if he had had his way, we would be inside, civil war, inside a constitutional crisis. Like, there's no better signal that, your dad thinks you're a big freaking liar than what Judge Luttig just said to John Eastman. And that's like a smack in the head. The only other just quick point I would make, Mary, is that I think it's really important to understand that the last hearing was person after person after person from inside the House telling Donald Trump, you lost the election. There's no merit. You lost the election. Today, person after person after person inside the House saying to Donald Trump, other than crackpot John Eastman, nobody supports this theory. And even John Eastman conceded that before he didn't concede it, this would lose 9-0 at the court. And so not only should John Eastman sort of be in leg irons after today, but I just think holding those two things together, everybody told him you lost. He picked another vehicle. It was dumber. Everyone told him it was dumb. He went forward anyway. And I just think, like, looking at those two as bookends, this is a body blow. Absolutely.
I just want to say really quickly, because Naveed, we're going to go to you quick, but welcome back, Dean, and welcome Adam and Ali. It's so great to have you guys here. Okay, Naveed,
so
what are you thinking?
Two quick things. Look, I'm not a legal scholar, so I was struck with, this was like watching a table read of Kill Bill by mergers and acquisition lawyers. You forget that just because their tone is flat, that it's still Kill Bill, right? Like, the substance, as Waj was saying, was so damning. To my second point, again, not a legal scholar, but the thing for me that I'm trying to figure out is, this wasn't just bad legal advice. Eastman wasn't proffering some legal idea that was just idiotic. It was corrupt. And so I felt that actually they did a masterful job in connecting this from being a shitty lawyer to actually criminal intent behind Eastman's. There's no way that he believed what he was saying. And so he was looking at this from a criminal prism. And that's a really important part, because it goes to the heart of this, that this wasn't debate amongst legal scholars of different legal opinions. This was someone trying to push through a big lie, which, by the way, was criminal. That's my thought.
Yeah. Brian?
Okay, I'll go quick. Trump probably upset he wasn't mentioned enough. Pence, the longest campaign ad on record. Eastman, does he go down for treason or a lesser charge? Jason Miller, common political hack, conservative media, complicit and irresponsible. Luttig and Jacobs, I can see those two arguing nuance over a brandy at the Penn Dennis Club, but they were horrifyingly honest and honestly horrified by what they saw. Otherwise, it was obvious how pained Luttig was as he testified. He moved me, although we all made jokes about him, and rightly so. Today, more than a traditional hearing, but far more damning than anything John Dean ever said, the Democrats have done well. They've avoided partisan politics by calling mostly Republicans to testify. And we're watching the Democrats giving their best effort to restore the traditional Republican Party and the values espoused by Jacob, small government and originalist interpretation of the Constitution. And as I said during it, I think this should be required viewing for every goddamn public school student studying government. They gave a just chapter and verse on how it works, schooled Donald Trump up, smacked everybody that followed him right across the face. And it's going to be interesting to see where it all ends up. But I think that it boiled down to a very typical Trump exchange. And it comes, everyone I've ever interviewed that knew Donald Trump, he starts with first a juvenile appeal. wouldn't it be cool to have the power? Come on, Mike. Come on, you want this. And then when he rejected it definitively, he goes, no, Mike, you can do it. So he's giving him a direct appeal and giving him permission to do it, which he'll throw him under the bus for later if he does. And then when he was rejected again, he went straight to Val Kilmer and Tombstone. If you don't do this, we can't be friends anymore. I mean,
yeah, what a threat. What a threat.
Yeah, yeah, so there was a lot to unpack, but it was very, very.
I'll be your Huckleberry, Brian. I'll be your
I'm the Huckleberry.
Can we just get a ruling on the hat? Can we get a ruling on the Eastman hat? Is there a takeaway
I
on
don't
that?
want anything good to be said about John Eastman.
No treason or a lesser charge. That's the only question.
just treason. Let's just go there. Dean.
First of all, I want to refer to as Dr. Obidala from now on. Just like John Eastman.
Hey, Doc.
I'm a lawyer.
Me too. I mean, yes, Dr. Obidala.
Dr. Obidala. You're a real doctor. I am here. This was a coup in search of a legal theory. And that's not my words. It's Judge Carter's words from the opinion on Eastman documents. I'm telling you, they are following along with that case where John Eastman didn't want to produce documents. Judge Carter's opinion, they are following along. I'm looking at this through the prism of what you can charge Donald Trump. That's all I care about. I don't care about the politics of it. I care about him being in prison. They've made a compelling case about John Eastman and his actions being truly illegal. They're done corruptly. There's no good faith basis. So the thing is connecting Donald Trump. And when you read Judge Carter's opinion, he does it. He says there's a conspiracy between Trump and John Eastman, overt acts. They have Trump saying things, having the meeting, furthering a plan that's not based in reality. In the judge's opinion from March, he talks about even John Eastman knew it was illegal. This is all we're hearing today is all in this opinion because the January 6th committee put that in writing already. So they laid out in that motion their case. There are two federal crimes, obstructing Congress and defrauding the United States government, not out of money, but out of their operations. One's a felony up to 5 years. The first one's a felony up to 20 years. That's how I'm watching it. They are making the case. They're going to bring it around to Donald Trump being involved. People are wondering, where's Trump? He's coming. It's going to join soon.
Yeah. Allie,
what treason? You think a lesser charge?
I want both charges. And again, Dr. Obidala, Brian, how dare you?
Okay, Doc, I'm sorry.
Yeah. Kitchen sink. Allie, what are your takes?
Yeah. No, like how Brian was saying, how in the book Peril, they said that it would be cool to reject the electors and that they wouldn't be friends anymore. That just struck me as like, this is the idiocy we were dealing with. And it's like, it's just so juvenile. I can't even explain it. And so just the thought that that could have led into almost a civil war in the country is terrifying. And then, it's just like at the same time, like we're arguing about rejecting electors or sending them back to the states. Why wasn't anybody saying the election wasn't stolen? Why wasn't anyone coming out at that time and saying, we need to stop this crazy talk. We're not doing either of these things. The election was not stolen. And so I don't know. It's still striking that we're at this point, and this is what they were talking about at that time.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, they're saying in their depositions that they knew, but at the time they're going on Fox News and supporting the big lie or saying nothing, right? And the thing about Donald and his just being a freaking toddler, you could say that's superficial, but you're right. The fact that tens and tens of millions of people think, we'll get to that later, but it is maddening. Adam, what do you have to say?
Adam Perkamenko, Brian Karam's school board campaign manager here. Great group. I agree with everything that's been said. I think just 2 points because I'm a political hack. One, I think Mike Pence lies more than Donald Trump. He's just better at it.
Yep.
And then I think it's amazing.
Well, maybe not more. Maybe not more. But anyway.
But I think Trump says terrible things that are often the truth. But no, I totally agree. I'm talking about Donald Trump, though, not Mary Trump. And last thing is, it's amazing to me to learn that there are people that work with Jason Miller that are sleazier than him. I didn't know that was possible.
I didn't know it was possible. You could still be employed, but you have a great point.
Yeah. All right, we're back.
January 6th, 2021.
Buckle up.
Which turned out to be a fateful day in our nation's history. Despite the fact that the vice president consistently told the president that he did not have and would not want the power to decide the outcome of the presidential election, Donald Trump continued to pressure the vice president, both publicly and privately. As you will hear, things reached a boiling point on January 6th, and the consequences were disastrous. In the middle of the night, on January 5th, into the morning of the 6th, around 1 a.m., President Trump tweeted at the vice president, meaning that the comments in response to the president's tweet would also show up on the vice president's Twitter feed. The tweet stated that the vice president could, quote, come through for us and send it back to the states. Then around 8 a.m. on January 6th, President Trump again tweeted, this time to say that the vice president could send it back to the states and, quote, we win. And that this is the time for extreme courage.
It's just the opposite of courage.
Mr. Short told us during his deposition that the vice president started a meeting on January 6th in prayer. Here is what Mr. Short said.
You arrived at the vice president's residence.
As would often be the case, I recall that knowing it would be an important day, we gathered in prayer. And often that would be something the staff member would lead. So it would have just been at that time, I believe, the vice president, myself, Greg, and Chris. And we would have just asked for guidance and wisdom, knowing that the day was going to be a challenging one.
Mr. Jacob, did you go to the vice president's residences on the morning of January 6th?
Yes.
Who else was with you?
Mark Short, Devin O'Malley, our communications director, and Chris Hodgson, our legislative affairs director.
And did the vice president have a call with the president that morning?
He did.
Were you with the vice president during the call?
So we had been putting the vice president had finalized his statement overnight. We were in the process of proofing it so that we could get that out. And we were told that a call had come in from the president. The vice president stepped out of the room to take that call, and no staff went with him.
The president had several family members with him in the Oval that morning for that call. I'd like to show you what they and others told the Select Committee about that call, along with never before seen photographs of the president on that call from the National Archives.
When I got in, somebody called me and said that the family and others were in the Oval. And do I want to come up? So I went upstairs.
And who do you recall being in the Oval Office?
Don Jr., Eric, Laura, Kimberly, I believe Meadows was there. At some point, Ivanka came in.
It wasn't a specific, formal discussion. It was very sort of loose and casual.
So then you said at some point there's a telephone conversation between the president and the vice president. Is that correct?
Yes.
When I entered the office the second time, he was on the telephone with who I later found out to be was the vice president.
Could you hear the vice president or only hear the president's end?
Only heard the president's end. But at some point it started off as a calmer tone and everything, and then became heated.
The conversation was pretty heated.
I think till it became somewhat, louder tone. I don't think anyone was paying attention to it initially.
Did you hear any part of the phone call, even if just the end that the president was speaking from?
I did, yes.
All right, and what'd you hear?
So as I was dropping off the note, my memory, I remember hearing the word wimp. Either he called him a wimp. I don't remember if he said, you are a wimp, you'll be a wimp. Wimp is the word I remember.
It's also been reported that the president said to the vice president that something to the effect of, you don't have the courage to make a hard decision.
Worse, I don't remember exactly either, but something like that, yeah. You're not tough enough to make the call.
It was a different tone than I'd heard him take with the vice president before.
Did Ms. Trump share with you any more details about what had happened, or any details about what had happened in the Oval Office that morning?
That her dad had just had an upsetting conversation with the vice president.
Do you recall anything about her demeanor, either during the meeting or when you encountered her in Dan Scavino's office?
I don't remember specifically. I mean, I think she was uncomfortable over the fact that there was obviously that type of interaction between the two of them.
Something to the effect, the wording's wrong. I made the wrong decision 4 or 5 years ago.
And the word that she relayed to that the president called the vice president, I apologize for being impolite, but do you remember what she said her father called him?
The P word.
The P word.
Mr. Jacob, how would you describe the demeanor of the vice president following that call with the president?
When he came back into the room, I'd say that he was steely, determined, grim.
Of course, the most dangerous part
We
of
know
what Donald
synonyms.
Trump did on January 6th was what he did himself. As will be discussed in detail in a future hearing, our investigation found that early drafts of the January 6th ellipse speech prepared for the president included no mention of the vice president. But the president revised it to include criticism of the vice president and then further ad-libbed. Here is what the president said on January 6th after his call with Vice President Pence.
I hope Mike is going to do the right thing. I hope so. I hope so. Because if Mike Pence does the right thing, we win the election. All Vice President Pence has to do is send it back to the states to recertify. And we become president, and you are the happiest people.
Turns out Pence did do the right thing.
Yeah.
And
we all are happier
I
people.
just spoke to Mike. I said, Mike, that doesn't take
Yeah.
courage. What
He only
takes
was talking about
courage
himself, of
is to
course.
do nothing.
Yeah.
That takes courage. And then we're stuck with a president who lost the election by a lot. And we have to live with that for 4 more years. We're just not going to let that happen. And Mike Pence is going to have to come through for us. And if he doesn't, that will be a sad day for our country. And they want to recertify their votes. They want to recertify. But the only way that can happen is if Mike Pence agrees to send it back. So I hope Mike has the courage to do what he has to do. And I hope he doesn't listen to the rhinos and the stupid people that he's listening to.
Stupid people. Every word he just said is a fucking
Of course,
lie. I'm
we all know
so
what happened next.
Over it.
The president's words had an effect. President Trump's supporters became angry. When the vice president issued his public letter, the crowd at the Capitol erupted in anger. The rioters who had erected makeshift gallows began chanting, "Hang Mike Pence." Testimony in our investigation has made clear what the target of the rioters' ire was: Vice President Mike Pence. The rioters breached the Capitol at 2:13 p.m. Now let's take a look at what was going on at the White House at this time. We received testimony that the president's chief of staff, Mark Meadows, was notified of the violence at the Capitol by 2 p.m. and likely earlier. The testimony further establishes that Mr. Meadows quickly informed the president and that he did so before the president issued his 2:24 p.m. tweet criticizing Vice President Pence for not having, quote, courage to do what needed to be done. Here is what the president wrote in his 2:24 p.m. tweet while the violence at the Capitol was going on. And here is what the rioters thought.
Nothing but a traitor, and he deserves to burn with the rest of them.
So this all escalated after Pence. What happened? Did Pence
Pence didn't do what we wanted. Pence voted against Trump. Okay, and that's when all this started? Yep, that's when we marched on the Capitol. We've been shot at with rubber bullets, tear gas.
We just heard that Mike Pence is not going to reject any fraudulent elector votes. That's right. You heard it here first. Mike Pence has betrayed the United States of America. Fuck you, Mike Pence. Mike Pence has betrayed this president, and he has betrayed the people of the United States, and we will never, ever forget.
It's real simple. Pence betrayed us, which apparently everybody knew he was going to, and the president mentioned it like 5 times when he talked. You can go back and watch the president's video.
This is our Capitol. Let's be respectful to him. There's 4 million people coming in, so it's a lot of control. We love you guys. We love the cops.
It's only a matter of time. Justice is coming.
Although the president's chief of staff, Mark Meadows, has refused to testify before this committee, Mr. Meadows' aide, Ben Williamson, and White House Deputy Press Secretary Sarah Matthews testified that Mr. Meadows went to the dining room near the Oval Office to tell the president about the violence at the Capitol before the president's 2:24 p.m. tweet. In future hearings, you'll hear more about exactly what was happening in the White House at that time. But here is what some White House staff told the Select Committee.
Do you know where he went?
Yes, I followed him down the hallway, and I followed him into the outer Oval corridor, which is the hallway between the Oval Office hallway and the outer Oval section of the Oval Office. I followed him into that little corridor hallway. I saw him walk into outer Oval. I maybe took a step into outer Oval and then left. And I don't know where he went outside of that, but it looked like he was headed in the direction of the Oval Office.
You know, we had all talked about at that point about how it was bad and the, you know, situation was getting out of hand. And I know Ben Williamson and I were conferring, and we thought that the president needed to tweet something and tweet something immediately. And I think when Kaylee gave us that order of don't say anything to the media, I told her that I thought the president needed to tweet something. And then
just don't get Eastman to write it.
Then I remember
Maybe
getting
they should have said that.
a notification on my phone, and I was sitting in a room with Roma and Ben, and we all got a notification. So we knew it was a tweet from the president, and we looked down, and it was a tweet about Mike Pence.
I believe I had sent him a text saying that we may want to put out some sort of statement because the situation was getting a little hairy over at the Capitol. And then it was common for, after I would text him, I would just go down and see him in person.
You went down to speak with Mark Meadows after this. What was that conversation?
Very brief. I went down and told him the same thing I have in the text that I can recall. And I don't remember anything that was said between us other than I told him that. And to my recollection, he immediately got up and left his office.
Our investigation found that immediately after the president's 2:24 p.m. tweet, the crowds both outside the Capitol and inside the Capitol surged. The crowds inside the Capitol were able to overwhelm the law enforcement presence, and the vice president was quickly evacuated from his ceremonial Senate office to a secure location within the Capitol complex.
By 2:24 p.m., the Secret Service had moved Vice President Pence from the Senate chamber to his office across the hall.
The noise from the rioters became audible, at which point we
recognized that maybe they had gotten into the building.
Then President Trump tweeted, Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country and our Constitution, giving states a chance to certify a corrected set of facts, not the fraudulent or inaccurate ones which they were asked to previously certify. USA demands the truth.
It was clear that it was escalating and escalating quickly. So then when that tweet, the Mike Pence tweet, was sent out, I remember us saying that that was the last thing that needed to be tweeted at that moment.
No
The situation
shit.
was already bad. And so it felt like he was pouring gasoline on the fire by tweeting that.
30 seconds later, rioters already inside the Capitol opened the East Rotunda door just down the hall. And just 30 seconds after that, rioters breached the crypt, one floor below the vice president.
The Secret Service couldn't control the situation and do their job of keeping him safe.
At 2:26 p.m., Secret Service rushed Vice President Pence down the stairs.
I think they've been trying to figure out whether they had a clear route to get us to wherever it was that they wanted to move us to.
We moved pretty quickly down the stairs and through various hallways and tunnels to the secure location. Upon arriving there, there was further discussion as to whether or not we were going to leave the Capitol complex or stay where we were.
Vice President Pence and his team ultimately were led to a secure location where they stayed for the next 4.5 hours, barely missing rioters a few feet away.
Approximately 40 feet. That's all there was. 40 feet between Vice President and the mob. Mr. Jacob, you were there, seeing that for the first time. Does it surprise you to see how close the
Why
mob
call them
was
rioters?
to the evacuation route that you took? The 40 feet is the distance
Good
from
question.
me to you, roughly.
Yeah, traitors.
I could hear the din of the rioters in the building while we moved, but I don't think I was aware that they were as close as that.
Make no mistake about the fact that the Vice President's life was in danger. A recent court filing by the Department of Justice explains that a confidential informant from the Proud Boys told the FBI the Proud Boys would have killed Mike Pence if given a chance. This witness, whom the FBI affidavit refers to as W1, stated that other members of the group talked about things they did that day, and they said that anyone they got their hands on, they would have killed, including Nancy Pelosi. W1 further stated that members of the Proud Boys said that they would have killed Mike Pence if given a chance. We understand that congressional leaders and others were evacuated from the Capitol complex during the attack. We'd like to show you what happened after the Vice President was evacuated from the Senate.
Glad they're linking the
Select
Proud
Committee
Boys
has
back.
obtained never-before-seen photos from the National Archives that show Vice President Pence sheltering in a secure underground location as rioters overwhelmed the Capitol. At 4:19 p.m., Vice President Pence is seen looking at a tweet the president had just sent, a tweet asking the rioters to leave the Capitol. After 4.5 hours spent on working to restore order, the Vice President returned to the Senate floor to continue the certification of electors.
Took it right to the
Vice
brain.
President Pence was a focus of the violent attack. Mr. Jacob, did the Vice President leave the Capitol complex during the attack?
He did not.
Can you please explain why the Vice President refused to leave the Capitol complex?
When we got down to the secure location, Secret Service directed us to get into the cars, which I did. And then I noticed that the Vice President had not. So I got out of the car that I had gotten into, and I understood that the Vice President had refused to get into the car. The head of his Secret Service detail, Tim, had said, "I assure you, we're not going to drive out of the building without your permission." And the Vice President had said something to the effect of, "Tim, I know you, I trust you, but you're not the one behind the wheel." And the Vice President did not want to take any chance that the world would see the Vice President of the United States fleeing the United States Capitol. He was determined that we would complete the work that we had set out to do that day, that it was his constitutional duty to see through, and that the rioters who had breached the Capitol would not have the satisfaction of disrupting the proceedings beyond the day on which they were supposed to be completed.
Let me see if I understand this right. You were told to get in the cars, and how many of the Vice President's staff got in the cars while he did not?
Most of us.
During our investigation, we received testimony that while the Vice President was in a secure location within the Capitol complex, he continued the business of government. We understand that the Vice President reached out to congressional leaders, like the Acting Secretary of Defense and others, to check on their safety and to address the growing crisis. In addition, the Vice President's Chief of Staff, Mark Short, made several calls to senior government officials. Here's Mr. Short's testimony regarding his call with Representative Kevin McCarthy.
He indicated that he had some conversation. I don't recall whether it was with the president or somebody at the White House, but I think he expressed frustration that not taking the circumstance as seriously as they should in that moment.
All right, so Mr. McCarthy indicated he'd been in touch with someone at the White House, and he conveyed to you that they weren't taking this as seriously as they should. You have to answer yes or no.
Yes.
Okay.
While the Vice President made several calls to check on the safety of others, it was his own life that was in great danger. Mr. Jacob, did Donald Trump ever call the Vice President to check on his safety?
He did not.
Mr. Jacob, how did Vice President Pence and Mrs. Pence react to that?
With frustration.
Yeah, I bet you that's being kind.
Mr. Jacob,
Understatement
before you and the
of the
Vice
year.
President were evacuated to a secure location within the Capitol, you hit send on an email to John Eastman explaining why his legal theory about the Vice President's role was wrong. You ended your email by stating that, quote, "Thanks to your bullshit, we are now under siege." We'll take a look at that email. And Dr. Eastman replied, and this is hard to believe, but his reply back to you was, "The siege is because you and your boss," presumably referring to the Vice President of the United States, "did not do what was necessary to allow this to be aired in a public way so the American people can see for themselves what happened." Mr. Jacob, later that day, you wrote again to Dr. Eastman. Let's show that email on the screen. In that email, you wrote, and I quote, "Did you advise the president that in your professional judgment, the vice president does not have the power to decide things unilaterally?" And you ended that email saying, "It does not appear that the president ever got the memo." Dr. Eastman then replied, "He's been so advised." And he ends his email with, quote, "But you know him. Once he gets something in his head, it's hard to get him to change course," close quote. Mr. Jacob, when Dr. Eastman wrote, "Once he gets something in his head, it's hard to get him to change
Who put it
course,"
there?
did you understand the he in that email to refer to the President of the United States?
I did.
And Mr. Jacob, did you hear from Dr. Eastman further after the riot had been quelled? And if so, what did he ask?
Late that evening, after the joint session had been reconvened, the Vice President had given a statement to the nation saying that violence was not going to win, freedom wins, and that the people were going to get back to doing their work. Later that evening, Mr. Eastman emailed me to point out that in his view, the Vice President's speech to the nation violated the Electoral Count Act, that the Electoral Count Act had been violated because the debate on Arizona had not been completed in 2 hours. Of course, it couldn't be since there was an intervening riot of several hours. And the speeches that the majority and minority leaders had been allowed to make also violated the Electoral Count Act because they hadn't been counted against the debate time. And then he implored me, now that we have established that the Electoral Count Act isn't so sacrosanct as you have made it out to be, I implore you one last time, can the Vice President please do what we've been asking him to do these last 2 days? Suspend the joint session, send it back to the states.
And we'll show you the text of that email, which Dr. Eastman wrote at 11:44 p.m. on January 6th. So after the attack on the Capitol and after law enforcement had secured the Capitol, he still wrote, as you described, quote, "So now that the precedent has been set that the Electoral Count Act is not quite so sacrosanct as was previously claimed, I implore you to consider one more relatively minor violation and adjourn for 10 days to allow the legislatures to finish their investigations." So even after the attack on the Capitol had been quelled, Dr. Eastman requested, in writing no less, that the Vice President violate the law by delaying the certification and sending the question back to the states. Is that correct, Mr. Jacob?
It is.
Did you eventually share Dr. Eastman's proposal with Vice President Pence?
Not right at that time because the Vice President was completing the work that it was his duty to do. But a day or two later, back at the White House, I did show him that final email from Mr. Eastman.
And what was Vice President Pence's reaction when you showed him the email where Dr. Eastman, after the attack on the Capitol, still asked that the Vice President delay certification and send it back to the states?
He said, "That's rubber room stuff."
I'm sorry, Mr. Wood. You said it's rubber room stuff?
Yes, Congressman.
What did you interpret that to mean?
I understood it to mean that after having seen play out what happens when you convince people that there is a decision to be made in the Capitol legitimately about who is to be the president and the consequences of that, that he was still pushing us to do what he had been asking us to do for the previous 2 days, that was certifiably crazy.
People are delusional.
We know that the Vice President did not do what Dr. Eastman requested because he presided over the
let's
completion
not let them off the
counting
hook with
of electoral votes.
Yeah, they're going to try that. Mental inquest.
Number of electors appointed to vote for President of the United States is 538. Within that whole number, a majority is 270. The votes for President of the United States are as follows. Joseph R. Biden Jr. of the state of Delaware has received 306 votes. Donald J. Trump of the state of
This
Florida.
was the one moment I thought he was
has
talking
received
like a man who was
232
ready to be
votes.
president for 14
The whole
days, and I
number
was
of electors
okay with that.
appointed to vote for Vice President of the United States is 538. Within that whole number, a majority is 270.
Well, not okay with his
Votes
being
for Vice
president, but
President of the United States
No.
are as follows.
being a candidate.
Kamala D. Harris of the state of California has received 306 votes. Michael R. Pence of the state of Indiana has received 232 votes. The announcement of the state of the vote by the President of the Senate shall be deemed a sufficient declaration of the persons elected President and Vice President of the United States, each for the term beginning on the 20th day of January, 2021, and shall be entered together with the list of the votes on the journals of the Senate.
Until this
and the
day,
House of
this was the most boring thing that these people did, was certify an election.
Right.
And on this
Mr.
day,
Jacob, we
in
heard
history.
Nobody
earlier
even
that
knew what
you and the
happened.
Vice President and the
Well,
team
reporters
started
did, but we
January
fell
6th
asleep
with a
during
prayer.
it.
I mean, normal.
You faced a lot of danger that
yeah.
day.
I mean, even those who
And this
did
is
know, like I
personal
said, fell
question.
asleep.
But how did your faith guide you on January 6th?
Oh, come on.
Nobody cares.
Um,
How did the
my
facts?
faith
happen?
really sustained me through it.
Like,
What kind of
I,
question is that?
down in the secure location, pulled out my Bible,
Throw away.
read
Okay.
through it, and just took great comfort. Daniel 6, was where I went.
He's a hero
And,
for not speaking up before
in
this.
Daniel 6.
Yeah.
His faith
Daniel has
got him
become
for a whole year and a half.
second in
Right,
command
what bravery.
of Babylon, a pagan nation.
Oh,
but
come
he
It's only until
completely
January 5th I
faithfully
realized
serves.
Trump was a menace.
He refuses an order from the king.
By the
that
way,
he cannot
America is a
follow,
pagan nation by definition.
and
so
he
there
does
you go.
his duty.
I mean, it's like the
consistent
former
with his oath
campaign
to
manager
God.
who
And
is now
I
working
felt
on
that that's what
the
had played out
consulting and
back
making money on the campaign against
spoke to you.
Cheney in the primary.
Yes.
Why do you think he threw
At the
the
end of the day,
the
Mark
faith thing
Short
in there
sent the
though?
vice president a text message with the Bible verse.
Bad move.
Here's what
First
he told
bad
the
move.
I
Senate
think
committee.
I think it's to the Trumpers.
Yeah.
3:50 in the morning when we finally adjourned
Republicans,
and
anyway.
headed on
Yeah.
our ways.
Well,
I remember
Same difference, huh?
texting the vice president a passage from 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse
the
7.
evangelicals to be
that,
pointed.
That's right.
I thought
Keep away
I
some
had
of the
this grace,
evangelicals.
I've kept the
Yeah.
faith.
Yeah.
They're not going to listen.
He started his day
Yeah,
with
they're
a
already
prayer
tuned out.
and ended
Exactly.
his day with a Bible
They're not
verse.
watching.
They're watching Fox, which is like
Fought the good
covering
fight.
a
Well,
bear driving a car.
Grace.
So what if a
and kept
Fox
the faith?
reporter or producer cuts out that clip and plays it?
White House
He or
attorney
she will be fired.
Eric Hirschman testified that the next day, January
I think
7th,
it's smart to do.
he
A lot
received a
of
call from Dr.
Christians, man.
Eastman.
This will
Yeah.
move.
Here is Mr. Hirschman's
I know
account
it's cynical
of that call.
politics, but you just
The
want
day
to.
after.
It was. I'm just saying it was planned.
Yeah,
Of
let's talk
course.
about that later.
I
I'm
remember
curious
why
about
he
that.
called me.
So, yeah.
Or he texted me or called me, wanted to talk with me, and he said he couldn't reach others. And he started to ask me about something dealing with Georgia and preserving something potentially for appeal. And I said to him, "Are you out of your effing mind?" Right?
I just
Right.
still can't get past
But I
the
only want to
background.
hear two words coming out of your mouth for now.
Panda
on.
justice.
Orderly transition. And I screamed, I said, I don't want to hear any other effing words coming out of your mouth, no matter what, other than orderly transition. Repeat those words to me. And I screamed,
What
that
did he say?
eventually he said, orderly transition. I said, good, John. Now I'm going to give you the best free legal advice you're ever getting in your life. Get a great effing criminal defense lawyer. You're going to need it. And then I hung up on him.
I love this shit.
In fact, just a few days later, Dr. Eastman emailed Rudy Giuliani and requested that he be included on a list of potential recipients of a presidential pardon. Dr. Eastman's email stated, quote, "I've decided that I should be on the pardon list, if that is still in the works." Dr.
glad he
Eastman did
decided
not
that.
receive his presidential pardon. So let's see what Dr. Eastman did as a result when he was deposed by this committee.
I assert my Fifth Amendment right against being compelled to be a witness against myself.
Did the Trump legal team ask you to prepare a memorandum regarding the vice president's role in the counting of electoral votes at the joint session of Congress on January 6, 2020? Dr. Eastman, did you advise the President of the United States that the vice president could reject electors from 7 states and declare that the president had been reelected?
God.
Dr. Eastman, the first sentence of the memo
Is
starts off by saying
contempt.
7 states have transmitted dual slates of electors to the president of the Senate. Is that
Tell me I don't
statement
look as
in
old
this
as him.
memo
He's
true?
the same age as me. God damn.
How old is he?
I think he's like 61 or 62.
He's like 25.
January 4th, 2021 conversation.
Fascism really ages them.
That's right.
That type of criminal offense ages you, I think.
So is it your
Yeah, it could be
position that
that
you
too.
can discuss in the media direct conversations you had with the President of the United States, but you will not discuss those same conversations with this committee?
Dr. Eastman pled the Fifth 100 times. Finally, let's hear from a federal court judge, the only one to date who has opined on whether the president was involved in criminal activity. Page 36 of Judge Carter's ruling says, quote, "Based on the evidence, the court finds it more likely than not that that President Trump corruptly attempted to obstruct the joint session of Congress on January 6, 2021. Page 40 of the ruling says, "Based on the evidence, the court finds that it is more likely than not that President Trump and Dr. Eastman dishonestly conspired to obstruct the joint session of Congress on January 6th, 2021. In page 44, Dr. Eastman and President Trump launched a campaign to overturn a Democratic election, an action unprecedented in American history. Their campaign was not confined to the ivory tower. It was a coup in search of a legal theory.
Hey, Dean, they stole your line.
Mr. Jacob, what would have happened to our democracy if Vice President Pence had gone along with this plan and certified Donald Trump as the winner of the 2020 election?
So there would have been short-term and long-term effects. The short-term I previously described, a constitutional jump ball situation, political chaos in Washington, lawsuits, and who knows what happening in the streets. And you would have had the Vice President of the United States having declared that the outcomes of these state elections were incorrect. So for all of those reasons, there would have been significant short-term consequences. But in the long term, we would have established a situation where a vice president would have asserted that one person could have the authority to determine the outcome of an election, which is antithetical to everything in our democracy. It's antithetical to the rule of law. And so it would have been significant impacts, both in the short and the long term.
Judge Ludig, in the statement you released earlier today, you wrote that the efforts by President Trump to overturn the 2020 election were, quote, the most reckless, insidious, and calamitous failures in both legal and political judgment in American history. What did you mean by that?
Palms are sweaty, knees weak, arms are heavy.
Exactly what I said.
Nice.
God.
Thank you, Judge. Thank you, Mr. Jacob. Mr. Chairman. I
The
yield
longest
back.
winded guy had the best comment, and he kept it as terse as he could.
Love it.
I love it.
Definitely MVP.
Oh,
Gentlemen,
God.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman. I want that back. Mr. Chairman, this was an informative hearing, a powerful hearing. I'm grateful for your lead and the leadership of the distinguished vice chair. Donald Trump knew he lost the 2020 election, but he could not bring himself to participate in the peaceful transfer of power. So he latched on to a scheme that, once again, he knew was illegal. And when the vice president refused to go along with it, he unleashed a violent mob against him. When we began, I asked how we got to this place. And I think the answer to that question starts with the fact that people in positions of power put their political party before their country. It cannot be allowed to continue. I'll yield back now, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Without objection, the chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Wyoming, Ms. Cheney, for a closing statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to my colleague, Representative Aguilar, and thank you very much to our witnesses today, Mr. Jacob and Judge Ludig. Thank you for being here with us. We have seen so far in our hearings that President Trump knew that his claims of a stolen election were false. You have seen that he knew that Mike Pence could not legally refuse to count electoral votes. And you have seen what President Trump did to pressure Mike Pence into taking illegal action. Over the course of our next hearings, you will see information about President Trump's efforts, John Eastman efforts, the Trump legal team's efforts to apply pressure to Republican state legislatures, state officials, and others. Judge Carter has recently written, quote, Dr. Eastman's actions in these few weeks indicate that his and President Trump's pressure campaign to stop the electoral count did not end with Vice President Pence. It targeted every tier of federal and state elected officials. We will examine all of those threats, and And we will examine the Trump team's determination to transmit materially false electoral slates from multiple states to officials of the executive and legislative branches of our government. We will examine the pressures put on state legislatures to convene to reverse lawful election results. An honorable man receiving the information and advice that Mr. Trump received from his campaign experts and his staff. A man who loved his country more than himself would have conceded this election. Indeed, we know that a number of President Trump's closest aides urged him to do so. This committee will address all of these issues in greater detail in the coming weeks. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Young lady yields back. Judge Ludick and Mr. Jacob, our nation owes you a great debt for your knowledge, integrity, and your loyalty to our Constitution. You and Vice President Pence are exactly the people our nation needed at a critical time. You had the courage to do what was right. In the weeks leading up to January 6th, many people failed this test when they had to choose between their oath to the country or the demands of Donald Trump. But there were others who, like you, stood tall in the face of intimidation and put our democracy first. They include the judges who rejected the bogus claims of election fraud, the senior Justice Department officials who stood up to Donald Trump, and the state officials whom we will hear from at our next hearing. We are deeply grateful to your courage and devotion to our country. There are some who think the danger has passed, that even though there were violence and a corrupt attempt to overturn the presidential election, the system worked. I look at it another way. Our system nearly failed and our democratic foundation destroyed, but for people like you. Judge Ludick, I want to give you an opportunity to share your thoughts on the ongoing threat. You've written the clear and present danger to our democracy. Now is that former President Donald Trump and the other
Just when you think it's over.
appear prepared to seize the presidency in 2024 if Mr. Trump or one of his anointed candidates is not elected by the American people. What do you mean by this?
This is the part that's like the credits during a Marvel movie.
Yep. It's waiting for the credits and then the piece after the credits.
Right.
Mr. Chairman, I'm honored beyond words by your words.
I'll bet he isn't.
I was honored on January 6, 2021. Then also honored beyond words to have been able to come to the aid of Vice President Mike Pence. I prayed that day, just like the Vice President prayed that day. I believe we may have prayed the same prayer to the same God. I prayed that same prayer with my wife this morning before I came into these hearings.
I love when they get the question they're not ready for.
I have written, as you said,
Just go straight to the praying.
We prayed.
Thompson, that today, almost 2 years after that fateful day in January 2021, that still Donald Trump and his allies and supporters are a clear and present danger to American democracy.
Roll credits.
That's not because of what happened on January 6th. It's because to this very day, the former president, his allies and supporters pledge that in the presidential election of 2024, if
At the end of this, they're going to say amen, and lunch is going to be served.
or his anointed successor as the Republican Party presidential candidate were to lose that election, that they would attempt to overturn that 2024 election in the same way that they attempted to overturn the 2020 election, but succeed in 2024 where they failed in 2020. I don't speak those words lightly. I would have never spoken those words ever in my life, except that that's what the former president and his allies are telling us. As I said in that New York Times op-ed, wherein I was speaking about the Electoral Count Act of 1887, the former president and his allies are executing that blueprint for 2024 in open and plain view of the American public. I repeat, I would have never uttered one single one of those words unless the former president and his allies were candidly and proudly speaking those exact words to America. Chairman, thank you for the opportunity to appear here today for these proceedings.
Thank you again, Judge Ludick. As a part of the Select Committee's charge to make recommendations that are informed by other investigative findings, we will be reviewing the views shared by Judge Ludick and other experts on potential improvements to the Electoral Count Act, among a range of other initiatives. I know the information we presented over the last week is shocking. The idea that a president of the United States would orchestrate a scheme to stay in power after the people have voted him out of office. We're able to present this information because so many witnesses have cooperated with our probe. But the fact is, there are more people with direct knowledge, with evidence germane to our investigation. I ask those who might be on the fence about cooperating to reach out to us. The committee's website address is being displayed behind me, january6th.house.gov. There you can view the evidence we presented in our hearings and find a tip line to submit any information you might think would be helpful for our investigation. And Despite how you might not think it's important, send us what you think. And I thank those who sent us evidence for their bravery and patriotism. Without objections, members will be permitted 10 business days to submit statements for the record, including opening remarks and additional questions for the witnesses. The chair requests those in the hearing room remain seated until the Capitol Police have escorted members from the room. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.
You guys see the breaking news about what Eastman is saying, by the way?
What's
No.
Eastman is saying that in a Substack post, Mr. Eastman said that his conversations with Virginia Thomas or her husband, Justice Clarence Thomas, about issues like, so he basically says there was nothing substantive in his conversations with Ginny Thomas.
Well, we already caught him lying once. I know everybody's going to rush to believe that crap.
So I just,
Well, it's totally believable because she didn't talk to anybody else about trying to overturn the election or
no,
text
she's very,
not at all.
email
so
anybody,
it was
call anybody,
just
so.
her pastor. She prayed on it.
I'm not really sure.
I think
Sorry.
the Mary Trump Show should launch a website that is you can submit follow-up questions for the committee that are suggested. You get 10 business days. There's all sorts of questions that come out of here we should suggest to these members.
I agree. I also agree that John Eastman should really shut up. But
He's screwed.
listen, I don't know about
Get
you
Rudy
all,
as
but
his lawyer.
I'm-
He'll be all right.
Yeah, sure. I'm exhausted. I'm completely exhausted. Hey, Dahlia, welcome back. This is exhausting. But that aside, again, one of the things that is that I understand why the committee needs to be respectful and grateful for the fact that these people finally did one thing right, and it was an important thing that they did right. They stood in the way of the most corrupt, inept, cruel, anti-American. We don't have that much time, so I'll end my adjective rant there. But preventing that person, Donald Trump, from stealing an election or a second election, but that's my opinion. But I really don't think we can lose sight of how complicit they were up until that point, because otherwise, and I think we started at the beginning with this concern, otherwise it becomes only about Donald and his small cadre of people who are continuing to be willing. We need to this is the entire, not just the entire executive branch, it's the entire Republican Party. They don't get to skate by making, and I know it sounds weird to say that, but like by making Donald the fall guy. Donald, of course, is the most responsible person, but he's had so much help, and they cannot be allowed to.
It begs a question.
And their ideology.
It begs this question. Wait a minute. It begs this question. How weak are the representatives that represent us, right? I mean, why didn't people, you're absolutely right. They waited till the absolute last moment to stand up to Donald Trump. But it also, the question that comes to mind is, how weak of a bully is Donald Trump that Mike Pence stood up to him? I mean, it ended up a battle of wills between those two guys, and Mike Pence bested Trump. I mean,
How weak were the 150, right, who voted to not to certify the election? I mean, in the end, again, I think that's such an important statement, Mary, because we do this again and again. We did this in Virginia, where we made it all about, hey, Glenn Youngkin is Donald Trump, as opposed to Glenn Youngkin is the Republican Party. Not everybody's going to seem and sound and look like Donald Trump, but but most of them, there's a few exceptions here and there who are showing themselves on the committee and whatever. They share that ideology. There's a reason we are here right now. And the fact of the matter is that we wouldn't be if they didn't share that ideology. They didn't share that contempt for government. And
I don't know if it's always ideology. I think sometimes it's just,
It's ideology.
Satan's cock. There's no there. I've seen these people.
I know, and
no
and
ideology.
Brian, for 4 years, these people privately, oh, Trump is awful, and then publicly, it's all
I know.
bullshit. It's all bullshit, and you're right. Like,
I'm not disputing that.
No, I know. I'm just
the ideology behind it. I think these people are fucking delusional.
Well, they love the power. They were in love. They would tell you.
All right, here's your ideology.
That's it. It's just power. That's it. They don't have any ideology. Look, I knew people who I came up with who ended up working for Trump, and 5-6 years ago, you would have never guessed that they were suddenly this transformational Republican. And they were, and they're relatively young. They're anointed to these positions they would have never been put in because they were young. And they love the power. And so they were willing, as Lev Parnas once told me, like Trump was completely manipulable. People would suggest things to him and he would just do it. They loved the access that they would say things and he would just do it. And I think that they wanted the train to keep going. And then when they realized it's not going to work out, they all jumped off and left him. And I don't want to like say that doesn't make you a good person. That makes you just a rat jumping off a sinking ship. Sorry to rant, but that's how I feel.
It's true. It's absolutely true. They just want the fucking power and they don't give a shit about America or Americans or American democracy. So first of all, Jen, I'm so happy you're back. But I want to go to Adam quickly because he got cut off. He didn't get to say much during the break. So Adam, is your head about to explode?
Hey, everyone. No, I think that I think with each of these hearings, we get more and more. And I think, look, I'm always the fight fire with fire guy and let's go at it. But I think a lot of people are pretty, quick online to dismiss the work that this committee's doing. And I think today we saw more, we learned more. And then when it was over, Benny Thompson gave them an opportunity to talk more and they were shitting their pants. So I love what we're seeing. Naveed said that John Eastman says there's nothing to see there with Jenny Thomas, which means there's a lot there. And and I'm curious,
look behind the curtain.
We all know Rudy Giuliani's pretty insane, but I have to imagine he's enjoying the fact that, this is the Trump attorney we're all talking about right now. So it's just incredible.
It is incredible. And Jen, you live tweeted the entirety of the hearing. So you've and that I think that's in some ways it's like a different way of paying attention as opposed to watching them without tweeting about it. So I'm curious what your takeaways are in terms of how this has been structured and how compelling / damning this is and effective the hearings this particular today was.
I mean, okay, so I can answer that except for the effective part.
Good point. Good point.
I mean, for me as a hearing connoisseur, I guess, I thought this was incredibly powerful. I thought it was exceedingly well done. I did miss a little window of time when I had to talk to Katie and tape her show, but I think it was mostly during a. To me,
you need to move to a big city so that stop happening. Sorry, you froze up for a bit. So go ahead.
I'm going to get someone to come in and do a mesh system in our house, but I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
The biggest takeaways are that Luttig tells us, and he's right, we're still at risk. And it was so chilling to hear him say that because, we heard the same thing from Robert Mueller, who was also a halting speaker. I mean, there's the same, these guys have been around for a long time and they're tired and they speak slowly, but they speak really deliberately and truthfully. And that was haunting. I also thought the staffer, I didn't catch her name, who worked for Mark Meadows, who was waiting for Trump to tweet something out and then he poured gasoline on the fire, was exactly right. I mean, I think the most powerful part of the narrative today was making us see, which I think we already knew, but putting together that exactly what was happening at the Capitol when Trump decided to, they said, read his letter aloud, but he decided to, at the ellipse, blame Mike Pence again, right? That he knew your sorry, not Trump, Donald, your uncle knows that words don't need to be truthful. Words just need to be effective.
And when they talked about the
Words-
staff in the car.
Yeah. I mean, so if words,
What?
yeah, the other thing was, so the other, so that words would get what he was, so he knew that he was whipping up the hate. I think the other thing was the quote from Pence, like actually hear what said why he wasn't going to get into the car with his Secret Service detail. So
Yeah, I trust you, but you're not the guy behind the wheel. It's just,
That's
Dahlia,
true.
it's chilling. And, Jen's right. I think those of us paying close attention aren't necessarily, I mean, there's nothing surprising in sort of the entirety of the story, but it's those details. It's people who were there and desperately worried about what was going on, saying things like, we all needed to have Donald calm things down, and he put gasoline on the fire, while there was this huge mob of armed insurrectionists trying to murder Mike Pence, Nancy Pelosi, and God knows what they would have done if they had gotten hold of congresswomen. I don't even want to think about it.
Can I just say one thing also? Earlier we were talking about how Mike Pence stood up to the bully. And I just recall, I think it was a few days after all of this went down, he was speaking publicly at an event saying that him and Donald are still close and that they just disagree on a few things. And I just thought that was insane to me. I'm like, you almost got killed, and here you are still
like
not being willing to stand up.
Can we call it a regular day in January at some point? Like he referred to it as just another day in January.
Right. Yeah. And that's connected to what I was framing, Dahlia, because or how we started this. It's that these people did the right thing for a day, and now
and never
Barr,
again.
McConnell, Pence will all do everything in their power to put Donald back in the Oval Office if they feel like that's the most expedient thing to do.
One thing I think
wait, Brian, this is for Dahlia.
No, I mean, I would reframe it slightly and just say this. We will be making an absolutely horrifying error if we take day 2 to be now it's Rudy's time in the barrel, and day 3 to be now it's John Eastman's time in the barrel. Like, if we walk away from this hearing and the narrative is like, holy hell, John Eastman's in trouble, then we have really, really screwed this up.
Although he is.
He is, yeah. And he is. And
that's not the only observation, right?
But I just think it's the temptation to sort of like pile on to the one guy who was in the clown car with Donald Trump is really, really tempting, because the guy in the clown car becomes this really interesting character. What? He took the fifth 100 times. What? He asked for a pardon, and then he didn't get a pardon, and then he took, it's an incredible, incredible story of self-owning pie in the face 500 times. And so you want to tell it. But I think the fact that everyone else was going to go along right up to the point that they couldn't go along, and then, by the way, a week later, they're back in the clown car wearing different noses. I just think we should be really clear that that's the story here, because right. I think the temptation to say, well, as long as we can nail John Eastman and maybe tangentially Ginny, or last week we could nail Rudy, but maybe tangentially Sidney Powell, we will have really screwed this up.
Can I ask you, but do you think that's that conclusion can be drawn from how the committee is crafting this, or do you just think that that's just the easiest thing for human beings to do?
That's how you got consensus on this committee. You did hagiography, Mike Pence hagiography, and Mark Short hagiography. And the way you did this is you all sat around and held hands and did a Bible study and talked about, what a hero Mark Short was. And that's the trade-off for being bipartisan, right?
That's what worries me.
You needed to get buy-in, but you're exactly right. What it leaves is, if everybody's kind of a good guy except for John Eastman, then how do you back out of that? And I'm not saying that's the only story to tell, but I'm saying that's the way this was structured.
It's also worth asking yourself, kind of the other folks, if they had been there, how many, when we're trying to make this about the Republican Party as it is, who else, if they had been sitting there, who would have done the right thing, and who would not have? Would Josh Hawley with his fist in the air? What would he have done? What would Ted Cruz have done? What would Rand Paul have done? What would Ron Johnson have done? And the sad fact is I could just go on and keep listing them, and I could, because it's about the party. It's about their corruption. It's about power over everything. That's their ideology. And again, we will fail if we just make it, as Dolly was saying, we just make it about Eastman today and somebody the other day, and we don't indict this entire party when the midterm's coming up. And no, not just for politics, but for the survival of our democracy, because otherwise they're going to win if we don't make it clear who they are.
That reminds me of when they saw Ted Cruz's desk. Oh, it's Ted Cruz's desk. He's with us. Okay. We're good.
Right. And that is I mean, they obviously it's Rudy Giuliani, it's John Eastman, and it's Donald. So it's not like they're letting Donald off the hook, but that is the danger that and this is exactly what I think Mitch McConnell would love. For, let's get rid of Donald so we can go about the business of electing somebody like Ron DeSantis, who's more presentable, more presentable and smarter, and more ideologically driven. And that would be a disaster. I think that would be the end of everything, quite honestly. I guess what confuses me though is that I sort of understand why Liz Cheney draws the line at going after Ginny Thomas. I think it's despicable, but I get it. She, on the other hand, has been completely kicked out of her party. She's been stripped of any power. She's not been shy about calling all of them out. So why would that be a compromise that she required in order to make the case? Anybody have any thoughts
for president? That's what she's doing.
Yeah. Can we just also add an asterisk to all this? We're talking about, let's not forget this. Let's not forget what these people were defending before January 6th, right? They were defending the Muslim ban. They were defending family separation. They were defending the worst homophobia, transphobia. I mean, the list goes on and on. These people were happy with this.
Just letting people die.
So were their voters.
Yes,
clear.
You're right.
Yeah.
No, you're absolutely right, Mary. But I think it's important to, when these people come off and they do these rehab tours and they're now testifying and say, I didn't really agree with them. It's important to remember that for 3+ years, they were happy with, as Cliff is saying, COVID and any of these other things. They wanted those things to happen. They were defending it. They were happy to serve under a president who was pushing these big things. Before the big lie, there was, I guess, medium-sized lies. They were happy with it. They didn't have a problem with it until that ship started sinking. This was all about self-preservation, which is your point about Liz Cheney. I don't think her motivations are these pure things. I think that she is, as Brian is saying, she's, look, I had a very long conversation with Adam Kinzinger. I actually like Adam quite a bit, but they know the writing on the wall. I mean, they know that they can't go forward, and these are political animals. That this is a calculus they're taking, and I think that she wants to do the right thing. I'm sure it's part of it, but I also think that this is part of her career.
Well, she's going to take advantage of the right thing
in
order to further her career.
And maybe that's okay, but
and maybe that's all right. Yeah, maybe that's all right. But
just put that asterisk in there.
Yeah, and I think at the end of the day, if we analyze this and look at it, I think the Democrats, to your point, have a strategy in mind. And so I don't think we'll get lost in, one day it's this, it's one day it's that. You can, you absolutely can. But I think the Democrats haven't. And I think everything is aimed at getting Donald Trump. So, I mean, if you corner Eastman, I mean, does he flip? What does he do? Where does he go? He's got nowhere to go. He's facing serious jail time. Maybe he decides to cough up some information that could damn Donald. You don't know. I mean, they know so much more than we do that I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt in this case that they have a strategy in mind. Because I was pleasantly surprised by the good, law doctor who, like we all, we made jokes about him being slow, but damn, he was powerful.
But
So,
can I just say, I think the answer to the Ginny question is the Supreme Court is the crown jewel of this project. And 100%. The things that we don't, if we don't understand, they're not giving up the Supreme Court. And it doesn't matter whether it's Michael Luttig or whether it's Mark Short or whether it's Liz Cheney. That's the win. because that's the way you do the thing. This is what Jen said, which is continue to be for vote suppression and continue to make sure that in 2024 the Republican wins the election. So going after Ginny is insane from that perspective, and I think we just need to understand that's the culmination of a 3-decade project, maybe a 5-decade project.
5 decade, yeah.
And that is not a thing they are going to give away ever.
Why is going after Ginny insane? Sorry, I didn't.
But wait, you just posted something, so can you?
No, I mean, I'm saying I just posted. Politico says that because when we started talking today, there was some question about whether Liz Cheney was going to be willing to really seriously drill down on Ginny, and I was very much of the view she wouldn't. And what I just posted was in Politico, apparently both Benny Thompson and Liz Cheney are now saying they're at least willing to talk to her.
Oh,
but I'm just my larger point was your question of, how does Ginny Thomas get folded into this? And I just think they're not going to lay a glove on Ginny Thomas because it would undermine this massive, massive win, which is they have the court for a generation.
Yeah.
Which is really demoralizing.
Clarence and that connection, and who was talking to DeSantis on the phone, and maybe they undermine their new, shining white horse that they want there instead.
Yeah. I mean, Dahlia, I don't disagree with you. It is tragic.
Repulsive?
Repulsive, tragic. It's unspeakable that despite everything else that's happened, like it's not enough. And that, again, I think in a weird way, the Republican Party superpower right now is that despite the fact that they all came this close to being raped, murdered, and maimed, wasn't a big deal.
It could have been. Hell, one of them got shot and is still against gun control.
Yeah.
And gay people, even though the person who saved his life was a...
Yeah.
And Ginny Thomas's husband is in the next 2 weeks going to give us the right to carry guns and the right to stop all abortions.
Even if we don't want the right to carry guns.
And prayer on the 50-yard line. And every single person who testified today is for that.
Yep.
We don't know what it
That's
says
what I
yet,
said.
Mary. They may say that you have to carry a gun.
That could be happening. Hey, I'm here in Ohio where Mike DeWine just made sure that
school teachers,
a whole bunch of schools. Thank God the school district my kids are in already. No way. I'm in a liberal area of Cincinnati, thankfully, but
yeah, but pretty soon nobody's going to have a choice. Everything will go to the Supreme Court, and they'll say, "Too bad, Supreme Court trumps everything."
But the spin is after Texas, we have to give the teachers guns because the cops don't use theirs.
Yep.
I think so. I think they're
Oh my
actually setting the teachers up to be the ones they blame. So then when there's a shooting, they can claim, look, we gave them the tools. They had the training that they needed and they didn't do it. So it's their fault, not ours.
Yeah. I mentioned that to Randy Weingarten, and I think she agrees.
And the other thing too is that there will be plenty of teachers who would say, absolutely not. Either I'm against it or I'm not equipped to be that person with a gun in that kind of situation. So they'll get fired, and they'll only be, it's like the kind of people you get on a jury that's a death penalty case. They're only people who believe in the death penalty.
Right.
It's going to be the same disastrous situation. So okay.
Stupid.
What more do we want our teachers to do?
Mary, you're gonna have to bring everyone back here for a gun conversation.
Yeah,
Well,
listen,
instead
we're
of
gonna-
paying our teachers, we're giving them guns, right? I mean,
we're
that's
going to
the
keep
way to do
doing
it.
this kind of thing, but let's go back to the hearings for a second, because let's credit where credit is due. It's compelling. It's incredibly well done. So let's talk for a second, and then I have to go because I have to do we all probably have other stuff to do, but given the fact that we can be reasonably skeptical about whether this changes how the Republican Party is held accountable, what can Democrats do with the information being put together, with the narrative that's being pieced together to continue to help people understand what's at stake?
Indictments.
Well, that's not up to Democrats, unfortunately. I wish.
Learn how to message things properly and stop.
They're horrible at that.
So frickin' weak. Like maybe take January 6th and take the fact that they're going to turn women basically into baby containers, and take the fact that they think their donors are more important than little babies being shot in school. Add that to an economic narrative about they only care about their elites, and point out how,
Yeah.
if I'm allowed to curse on here or not. But
I meant specifically what's happening in the hearings, but all of that
I'm just
is
saying,
is
like,
totally
you
true.
can build a broader narrative about them from these hearings, about who they are and who they care about, along with the other issues out there. And we're not doing it right now.
No, we're not.
So I cut my teeth on Trump Russia at MSNBC, and one of the things that I learned from that is that the Democrats made it so freaking complicated that the average person couldn't follow it. And this is clear cut. There's criminality here. What the Democrats have done is laid out a really academic argument. They've done it, I think, incredibly well. But to the average person who's not watching this, as I think Waj was saying, it's the soundbite, right? The Democrats have a messaging problem, as Cliff is saying. They need to make this as simple to understand as possible. And look, it seems like a simple thing, but they totally fucked that up with the whole Trump Russia thing. And that is not an easy thing. Take 3-4 days of testimony and boil it down to 10 minutes. That's a tough thing, but that's what you're up against. That's how you have to convince the American people. They need those sound bites. They need to know why this matters, what Trump did, that he did something that is criminal. You got to make that argument. You got to make it cleanly and simply. That's what's up against them.
Right. Jen?
Yeah, I agree. And nice to see you again, Naveed. The bottom line is he lost the election. He couldn't get anyone to agree with him in the courts. Basically, he used every avenue to overturn a lawful election. And when that wouldn't work, he tried to get Mike Pence to do something illegal. And when that didn't work, he set his people who he said to stand back and stand by, he told them to go at it and tear it all down. That's what happened.
Yeah. And we got to go, but I just want to give everybody one very quick last word. Mine is one of the best things is the fact that they're only using Republican witnesses. I'll say it again because I think it's incredibly important. Cliff, last word quickly.
My last word is that we need to refer to Loudermilk and everything they did as treason tours.
Absolutely. Allie.
I was just going to say that I think these hearings are like the most important thing we could do is just keep playing them on primetime news, keep talking about them all day long, do exactly what the Republicans did during Benghazi about Hillary Clinton, and just keep pressing the issue.
Absolutely. Adam?
A bunch of independents don't think that Donald Trump was responsible for this, so I think we should keep playing the clip where Kevin McCarthy says everybody in this country is responsible for January 6th.
Interesting. Naveed?
I'm going to quote Eminem again. Tear this motherfucking roof off like two dogs caged. That's what they need to do. This is no joke. It's our democracy. They got to bring the fire.
We need it's a cage match. We need brass knuckles. Brian?
Abstract thought. Shouldn't we have all seen this coming? Chicago chickens, Loudermilk, Cesario. I mean, are these NPCs? What are we living in a simulation? And what the fuck? But yeah, bottom line is,
I wish we were.
Bottom line is, you've got to have at the end of this, there's got to be an indictment, and it's got to be Donald, and it's got to be done. And we're not going to be able to put this behind us as a country until we bring these people to justice once and for all.
Yeah, we'll be definitely talking about that as the hearings proceed. Jen, last word. Jen? Oh, there you are.
Lock him up.
Love it.
I
Dahlia.
like that. Yeah.
Well, I'd say lock them up, but
Yes.
I'm gonna take
Let's
all
start a
the-
trend. Lock them up.
all the fire you've just heard. I'm gonna just dampen it completely with my lawyerly wet blanket. Are you ready? I'm gonna.
No,
this
I'm
is
not.
this is why you pay me the
I'm
big bucks.
impervious.
This is why you pay me the big bucks. I'm going to say that one of the things we learned today is that the Electoral Count Act is a fucking mess, and it is fixable. And all of the stuff that Michael Ludick landed on in his very, 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 very sweet conclusion about this is going to happen again in 2024, well, we could fix it. And we could fix it by making fixes to really old, bad, obscure laws that we could get bipartisan support. So the thing that I'm going to say, in addition to lock him up and get indictments, is that we could actually reform the way we elect people.
That's
and
great.
That can be done.
Yeah, I think
love that.
that's because that's practical.
Your lips to
and
God's
it
ears.
has so
Bring in
much
God.
that would have such an impact on how things go forward. Okay, we're out of time.
Mary, we
but
also learned one more thing. Mary's never going to invite me again. We also learned that Mike Pence has a rubber room full of an endless supply of condoms. Which I thought was pretty interesting.
That means you have to come back, please.
I thought we all knew that.
So Brian Karam, Naveen Jamali, Anna Porkomenko, Ali Samarco, Cliff Schechter, Jen Taub, Dahlia Lithwick, Dino Badala, and Wajahat Ali. Thank you all so much for being here. I know this is tough stuff, but you guys helped me get through it, and you helped so many other people. So we'll do it again. And in the meantime, stay safe.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks,
Thank you.
guys. Take care.
Always a pleasure.
Yeah.